In the beginning, before the concept of ending could take shape in the minds of gods or mortals, the seers knew what would come. The vulva, those wise women who walked between worlds and peered through the veils of time, spoke in riddles and verses of a day when everything would burn. Their prophecies were not warnings meant to change the course of fate, for in the Norse understanding of existence, fate was not a river that could be redirected. It was the loom upon which reality itself was woven, and every thread had already been measured, cut, and placed by hands that knew no mercy and granted no exceptions. The cosmos itself was born from violence. In the void called Ginnungagap, where fire and ice met in the space between nothingness, the first being came into existence through the melting frost. Ymir, the primordial giant, emerged from that collision of opposing forces, and from his body the gods would later craft the known world. This act of creation through destruction set a pattern that would echo through all the ages to follow. Nothing in the Norse understanding of existence could remain forever. Everything that had a beginning carried within it the seed of its own ending, and the gods themselves were no exception to this fundamental truth. The architecture of the cosmos reflected both magnificent order and inherent instability. At the center of all things stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, an ash of such immense proportion that its branches sheltered entire realms, and its roots delved into wells of wisdom and fate that no living being could fully comprehend. This tree was not merely a symbolic representation of connection between worlds. It was the actual framework upon which reality hung, a living pillar that breathed and suffered and endured. 3 roots anchored it in 3 directions, each reaching toward a different well, each drawing sustenance from waters that carried their own significance and power. The first root stretched down to Urdarbrunna, the Well of Fate, where the Norns dwelt in their eternal task of shaping destiny. These 3 women, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, whose names meant past, present, and future, sat beneath the branches and carved runes into the trunk of Yggdrasil itself. Every mark they made was a life begun or ended, a choice made inevitable, a doom sealed before the one doomed even drew breath. They watered the roots of the great tree with sacred water mixed with the clay from the well's banks, and this daily ritual kept the ash alive, even as it rotted from within. For Yggdrasil, like all things in the Norse cosmos, was already dying. The dragon Nidhogg gnawed eternally at its roots in the darkness below, and the great stag and 4 deer that wandered its branches ate away at the tender shoots above. The second root descended to Mimisbrunna, the well of wisdom, where Mimir kept his eternal vigil. This well held knowledge that even the gods craved desperately enough to make terrible sacrifices to obtain. Odin himself, the All-Father, the chief of the gods and the master of Asgard, had given one of his own eyes to drink from these waters. That single draught had granted him insight beyond what any other god possessed, but it had also shown him the shape of things to come. The visions he received from Mimir's well included the sight of his own death, and the death of everything he had built and ruled. This knowledge did not grant him the power to prevent what was coming. It only ensured that he would face it with open eyes and full awareness of the futility of resistance. The third root reached toward Vergelmir, a roaring cauldron of spring water from which countless rivers flowed, some carrying venom rather than pure water. This was the root most tormented by Nidhogg, the serpent whose name meant the one who strikes with malice. The dragon did not gnaw at the tree out of hunger or mindless destruction. He chewed at the roots with purpose and intelligence, knowing that his patient work would eventually contribute to the unraveling of all things. Between his bouts of destruction, he would fly up through the branches to exchange insults with the eagle that perched at the very crown of Yggdrasil. A squirrel named Ratatosk scurried endlessly up and down the trunk, carrying these insults between the two enemies, ensuring that their hatred never cooled and their conflict never found resolution. Upon this trembling frame hung 9 distinct worlds, each inhabited by different beings, each with its own character and fate. Asgard, the realm of the gods, stood highest in the branches, connected to the middle world by the burning rainbow bridge called Bifrost. This was where the Aesir made their halls and held their councils, where they drank mead and settled disputes, and watched over the other realms with varying degrees of attention and care. The gods built great structures in Asgard, palaces roofed with gold and silver, halls large enough to hold all the honored dead who would one day be needed for a final battle. They thought themselves secure in their high realm, protected by walls and warriors and their own divine power, but security was an illusion in a cosmos already marked for destruction. Midgard, the middle world, was the realm of humans, those strange, short-lived creatures made from driftwood by Odin and his brothers in the early days of creation. The gods had fashioned humanity almost as an afterthought, giving them consciousness and form, naming them Ask and Embla, setting them down in a world encircled by an impassable ocean. In that ocean swam Jormungandr, the World Serpent, one of the monstrous children born to Loki and the giantess Angerboda. The serpent had grown so vast that it encircled all of Midgard, grasping its own tail in its mouth, creating a living boundary beyond which mortals could not pass. The creature slept in the depths, dreaming whatever dreams might come to a beast whose existence was itself a prophecy of doom. Jotunheim was the realm of the giants, those ancient beings who predated even the gods, and who remembered when Ymir still lived, and the world was nothing but his body waiting to be butchered. The giants were not uniformly evil, nor were the gods uniformly good. The relationship between these two races was complex, marked by marriage and murder, by theft and trade, by grudging respect and open warfare. Some giants possessed wisdom that exceeded anything the gods could claim. Others were forces of pure elemental chaos, interested only in the destruction of the order that the gods had imposed upon the world. Between Asgard and Jotunheim stood an eternal tension, a balance that could not be maintained forever. Vanaheim housed the Vanir, that other tribe of gods who once warred with the Aesir before peace was made and hostages exchanged. Alfheim belonged to the Light Elves, creatures of beauty and grace whose allegiances in the coming conflict remained mysterious. Svartalfheim, sometimes called Nidavellir, was the realm of the dwarves, master craftsmen who forged in their underground workshops the weapons and treasures that would play crucial roles in the final days. Muspelheim burned eternal in the south, a realm of pure fire ruled by the giant Surtr, who had existed since before creation and who waited with his flaming sword for the day he would be unleashed. Niflheim froze in the north, a land of ice and mist and numbing cold where the dishonored dead wandered in misery. And beneath all, or perhaps beyond all, lay Helheim, the realm of the dead, ruled by Hel, another of Loki's monstrous children. She was half living flesh and half corpse, a being of profound authority who judged no one but kept all who came to her domain, except for those few who had died gloriously in battle and been chosen by the Valkyries for Valhalla. Her realm would play a complicated role in the events to come, for death itself would be transformed when the final battle began, and even the dead would have their part to play. The Norns who shaped fate did not work in isolation from these cosmic structures. They were woven into the fabric of existence as surely as the threads they cut and measured. When they looked into the depths of Urdarbrunna, they saw not just the past and present, but the fixed points of the future that could not be altered. Among these certainties was the event that came to be known as Ragnarok, though it had other names as well. The doom of the gods, the twilight of the powers, the fate of the divine beings. Different peoples told the story in different ways, but certain elements remained constant across every telling. There would come a time, the Norns knew and the Volva proclaimed, when the bonds that held chaos at bay would fail. The children of Loki, bound and imprisoned by the fearful gods, would break their chains. The dead would rise. The sky would shatter. Fire and ice would consume the ordered world and return existence to something resembling the void from which it had first emerged. And in that time of unmaking, the gods themselves would take the field of battle, one final time, against enemies they had created through their own choices and fears. The prophecy was specific in its details, naming particular combatants and foretelling their fates. Odin would fall to the wolf. Thor would slay the serpent but perish from its venom. The trickster and the watchman would kill each other. The beautiful god who had already died once would remain in the land of the dead, unable to return until after the fires had passed. These were not possibilities or potential outcomes. They were certainties, carved into the fabric of fate by the Norns themselves, visible to anyone with the sight to perceive them. What drove the gods to continue knowing what would come? Why build halls that would burn, forge alliances that would break, gather warriors who would fall? The answer lay in the Norse understanding of courage and honor, concepts that transcended simple survival. The gods knew they were doomed. They knew that everything they built would crumble and everything they loved would be lost. And still they rose each morning in Asgard. Still they held their feasts and made their plans. Still they prepared for the battle they could not win. This was not optimism or denial. It was something far more profound, a commitment to face fate without flinching, to die well, even when death was inevitable. The signs that would herald the approach of Ragnarok were etched into the prophecy as clearly as the final fates of individual gods. The world would suffer through winters of unprecedented harshness, seasons without relief or warmth. Kinship would dissolve as brother turned against brother and father against son. The social bonds that held communities together would fray and snap. Morality itself would collapse as people abandoned the old codes in favor of raw survival. The natural order would begin to fail, with beasts behaving strangely and the heavens showing portents that filled observers with dread. These signs were not merely predictions. They were observations of patterns that the Norse people recognized in their own world. They lived in a harsh environment where winter could kill, where kinslaying was the worst of crimes, where the breakdown of social order meant death for communities that depended on cooperation to survive. The prophecy of Ragnarok took the fears and realities of Viking Age Scandinavia and projected them onto a cosmic scale, suggesting that the struggles of mortal life reflected larger struggles in the realm of the divine. The gods themselves contributed to the coming doom through their own actions and choices. When they bound Fenrir, the wolf born to Loki and Angerboda, they did so out of fear of a prophecy that said he would one day devour Odin. But in binding him through trickery, in betraying the trust that the young wolf had shown by allowing them to test their chains upon him, they created the very enemy they feared. The wolf would remember his betrayal. His hatred would grow with each passing age, and when he finally broke free, his rage would be implacable. When they cast Jormungandr into the ocean, thinking to be rid of another monstrous child, they only ensured that the serpent would grow to apocalyptic size, feeding on whales and ships until it became large enough to encircle the world. When they sent Hel to rule the realm of the dead, they created a power beyond their control, a goddess who would one day provide forces for the armies of chaos. Every precaution the gods took to prevent Ragnarok became a thread in the tapestry of its inevitability. And Loki himself, the complex figure who stood sometimes with the gods and sometimes against them, whose cunning had saved Asgard as often as it had threatened it, he too was bound. After the death of Baldr, the most beloved of all the gods, a death that Loki had orchestrated through his malice and trickery, the Aesir finally hunted him down and imprisoned him in a cave. They bound him with the entrails of his own son, transformed by magic into unbreakable chains. Above his face they placed a serpent, whose venom dripped burning onto his skin for eternity. His wife, Sigyn, remained loyal, holding a bowl to catch the venom, but when the bowl filled and she had to empty it, the poison would fall upon Loki, and his convulsions of agony would shake the earth itself, causing what mortals called earthquakes. He too would break free when the time came, and his vengeance would be terrible. The binding of Fenrir was an act of desperation disguised as wisdom. When the wolf was young, he lived among the gods in Asgard, and only Tyr, the god of war and justice, was brave enough to feed him. The wolf grew at an alarming rate, his strength doubling and tripling with each passing season, until even the gods began to feel the stirrings of fear in their immortal hearts. They had heard the prophecies. They knew what the Völva had spoken. This wolf would one day devour Odin himself during the final battle, would swallow the All-Father whole, and end the reign of the chief of gods. Rather than face this destiny with acceptance, the gods chose to interfere with fate itself. They commissioned chains from the dwarves, bindings that they hoped would hold the wolf forever. The first chain was called Liding, and it was massive, forged from iron that had been folded and reforged countless times. The gods approached Fenrir with false friendliness, suggesting that he test his strength against their chain, framing it as a game rather than an imprisonment. The wolf agreed, always eager to demonstrate his power, and when they wrapped Liding around him, he simply flexed his muscles and the chain shattered into pieces that flew across the floor of the hall. The gods commissioned a second chain, this one called Dromi, twice as strong as the first. Again they approached Fenrir with their false smiles and their game of testing strength. The wolf was more suspicious this time, sensing perhaps that their intentions were not as innocent as they claimed, but his pride would not allow him to refuse the challenge. They bound him with Dromi, wrapping the chain around him many times, securing it with locks and fastenings. Fenrir waited until they had finished, then erupted with such force that Dromi exploded into fragments. The gods took several steps backward, their fear now visible on their faces. It became clear that normal chains, no matter how well forged, would never hold the wolf whose destiny was to bring about the end of the world. Odin sent a messenger to Svartalfheim, to the dwarves who worked in the darkness beneath mountains, whose craftsmanship exceeded anything the gods themselves could produce. He asked them to create a binding that could hold Fenrir, and he did not care what materials or methods they used to accomplish this task. The dwarves accepted the commission, and they crafted something that seemed to defy the logic of the physical world. They called it Gleipnir, and it appeared to be nothing more than a silken ribbon, soft and thin, something that could be torn apart by any creature with even modest strength. But the dwarves had woven it from 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. These things did not exist in any conventional sense, or they existed in such a way that they could not be perceived or captured under normal circumstances. By binding together these impossibilities, the dwarves had created a fetter that could not be broken by any force in the 9 worlds. When the gods received Gleipnir, they marveled at its delicate appearance and trusted in the assurances of the dwarves who had made it. But now they faced a problem. How would they convince Fenrir to allow himself to be bound a 3rd time? The wolf had grown even larger and more powerful, and his suspicion of the gods had deepened into something approaching certainty that they meant him harm. The gods decided to make an excursion to a particular island called Lyngvi, which sat in the middle of a lake called Amsvartnir. They invited Fenrir to come with them, suggesting that they had one more test of strength to propose, one final chance to prove his might against their craftwork. Fenrir looked at the silken ribbon they showed him and immediately understood that this was no ordinary binding. Something about Gleipnir troubled him in ways that the massive chains had not. He voiced his suspicions openly, saying that he saw no honor in breaking such a thin ribbon, and that if it was made with such trickery and magic that it could hold him, then he had no interest in testing it. The gods protested, saying that surely he could break a simple ribbon if he had broken chains as mighty as Lading and Dromi. They shamed him and challenged his courage, but Fenrir would not be moved by their words alone. Finally, the wolf proposed a condition. He would allow them to bind him with Gleipnir, but only if one of the gods would place their hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith. If the ribbon proved to be a trick, if it held him through magic and could not be broken, then he would bite off the hand of whoever made this pledge. The gods looked at one another, and none wished to volunteer. They all knew that if Gleipnir worked as the dwarves promised, they would be condemning one of their number to mutilation. Their hesitation confirmed everything that Fenrir suspected, but it also presented them with an impossible choice. Tyr stepped forward. The god of war and justice, the one who had fed Fenrir when he was young, the one who had shown the wolf more kindness than any other in Asgard, placed his hand between those massive jaws. Fenrir allowed the gods to wrap Gleipnir around him, to bind his legs and secure the ribbon with knots that seemed ridiculously inadequate for the task. Then he tested the binding, and for the first time he could not break free. The more he struggled, the tighter Gleipnir became, the impossible materials holding him with absolute certainty. He thrashed and pulled and bit down, and Tyr's hand was severed at the wrist, blood pouring from the stump as the god of justice paid the price of betrayal. The gods laughed, all except Tyr, who cradled his wounded arm and said nothing. They took the end of Gleipnir and threaded it through a massive boulder called Gjoll, then drove that boulder deep into the earth and secured it to an even larger stone called Thviti. Fenrir howled with rage and betrayal, understanding now that the gods had feared him so much that they had resorted to trickery and broken oaths to imprison him. To silence his howls, they took a sword and placed it vertically in his mouth, the hilt against his lower jaw and the point against his upper palate, forcing his jaws to remain open. Foam and drool poured from his mouth, forming a river that the Norse called Van, meaning hope or expectation. And there the wolf remained, bound on that island, waiting for the day when Gleipnir would finally fail, and he would be free to take his revenge. Loki's imprisonment came later, after the death of Baldr had revealed the depth of his malice, and the danger he posed to the order that the gods had established. The death of Baldr was itself a tragedy that hastened the approach of Ragnarok, for Baldr was the most beloved of all the gods, the most beautiful, the most wise, the most kind. When he began to have dreams of his own death, his mother Frigg travelled through all the 9 worlds, extracting oaths from every substance and creature that they would not harm her son. She received promises from fire and water, from iron and all metals, from stones and earth, from trees and diseases, from beasts and birds and venomous snakes. She made everything in creation swear that it would not harm Baldr. Everything, that is, except for one small plant. Mistletoe seemed too young and insignificant to bother with, too soft and weak to pose any threat. This oversight became the instrument of tragedy. When the gods discovered that Baldr had become invulnerable, they made a game of it, throwing weapons at him and watching them bounce harmlessly away, laughing as swords and axes failed to cut his divine flesh. Loki watched these games with growing resentment and jealousy. He disguised himself as an old woman and went to Frigg, asking in casual conversation whether everything in the world had truly sworn not to harm Baldr. Frigg, seeing no danger in this harmless old woman, mentioned the mistletoe that grew west of Valhalla, that young shoot that had seemed too insignificant to include in her collection of oaths. Loki went immediately to find this mistletoe. He cut it carefully and shaped it into a dart, then returned to the hall where the gods were still playing their game with Baldr. He approached Hodr, Baldr's blind brother, who stood apart from the festivities because he could not see to participate. Loki placed the mistletoe dart in Hodr's hand and guided his arm, suggesting that he too should honor Baldr by throwing something at him. Hodr, grateful to be included, threw the dart with Loki's guidance, and it struck Baldr in the chest and killed him instantly. The hall fell silent. The most beloved of the gods lay dead, killed by the one thing in all creation that had not sworn to protect him. The gods' grief was absolute. They tried everything to bring Baldr back from the realm of hell. They sent Hermod, the messenger god, on Odin's horse, Sleipnir, to ride to the land of the dead and plead with Hel herself for Baldr's return. Hel agreed, but only on the condition that every living thing in all the worlds would weep for Baldr, proving that he was truly loved by all creation. Messengers went out, and everything wept, people and animals, stones and metals, trees and earth itself. Everything wept, except for one giantess found in a cave, a creature named Thok, who refused to shed a single tear. Most believed that Thok was actually Loki in disguise, ensuring that Baldr would remain in the land of the dead. The gods could no longer tolerate Loki's presence among them. They hunted him across the worlds, and though he used all his shape-shifting abilities to hide, they eventually cornered him. They took his sons, Vali and Narfi, and in a moment of cruelty that showed how far the gods had fallen from their own ideals of justice, they transformed Vali into a wolf, who immediately tore his brother Narfi apart. They took the entrails of Narfi and used them to bind Loki to 3 flat stones in a cave, 1 stone under his shoulders, 1 under his loins, and 1 under his knees. The entrails hardened into chains of unbreakable iron, secured by magic that even the clever trickster could not undo. Then they brought a venomous serpent and fixed it to the roof of the cave above Loki's face, so that its poison would drip constantly onto him. The venom burned like fire, searing his skin and bringing him agony that would have killed a mortal instantly. His wife Sigyn, alone among all beings showing him any loyalty or love, stayed with him in that cave. She held a bowl above his face to catch the poison, protecting him as best she could, but periodically the bowl would fill, and she would have to turn away to empty it, and in those moments the venom would fall directly onto Loki's face. His convulsions of pain were so violent that the entire earth would shake, causing the earthquakes that mortals feared and could not explain. Bound in his cave, Loki's thoughts turned darker with each passing year. The trickster who had once saved the gods as often as he had endangered them, who had used his cleverness to retrieve Thor's hammer and win treasures for Asgard, who had been blood brother to Odin himself in the distant past, now had nothing but time to nurse his hatred. He thought of Baldr, the death he had caused. He thought of his children, the monstrous offspring the gods had so feared that they bound Fenrir, cast out Jormungandr, and exiled Hel. He thought of his sons, one transformed into a beast, and the other torn apart, their blood used to bind their father. All the humour and mischief drained away, leaving only rage and the desire for revenge that would consume everything when he finally broke free. The giants watched all these events from Jotunheim, and they drew their own conclusions about the gods and the order that the Aesir had imposed upon the world. Many giants remembered the murder of Ymir, their progenitor, whose body had been carved up to make the earth and sky. They remembered how the gods had taken the corpse of the first giant and transformed it into the world itself, using his flesh for soil, his blood for the seas, his bones for mountains, his hair for trees, his skull for the dome of heaven, and his brains for the clouds. This act of cosmic butchery had never been forgiven or forgotten. Relations between gods and giants had always been complicated, marked by marriages and alliances, as well as by theft and warfare. Thor made regular journeys into Jotunheim to kill giants, considering it sport and duty both to reduce their numbers. The gods had stolen the mead of poetry from the giant Surtr, had taken treasures from various giant holdings, had broken promises and violated hospitality. Some giants had wisdom that exceeded anything found in Asgard, like Mimir, whose head Odin kept preserved to consult in times of crisis. Others possessed knowledge of magic and prophecy that the gods needed for their own purposes, but the binding of Fenrir, the imprisonment of Loki, and the casting out of Jormungandr and Hel demonstrated to the giants that the gods were willing to betray oaths, torture prisoners, and punish the innocent for the crimes of their parents. These were not the actions of just and honorable rulers. These were the actions of tyrants who maintained their power through fear and violence, who spoke of order and law while breaking every principle they claimed to uphold. The giants began to prepare, gathering forces, forging alliances, waiting for the signs that would signal the beginning of the end. In Muspelheim, Surtr had been waiting since before the world was made. The fire giant stood taller than mountains, his skin burning with eternal flame, his sword blazing so brightly that it outshone the sun itself. He was not a creature of the ordered world that the gods had made. He existed before that order, and he would exist after it fell. His purpose was singular, to bring the flame that would consume everything, to reduce the elaborate structures of creation back to the primal fire from which they had been temporarily separated. He did not hate the gods personally. He simply understood that their time was finite, and he waited with infinite patience for the moment when he would be called forth to fulfill his purpose. The moral degradation of the world had already begun. Odin, in his quest for knowledge of what was to come, had sacrificed much of what made him worthy of respect. He had hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced with his own spear, refusing food or drink, suffering until he could perceive the runes and their meanings. He had given his eye for a drink from Mimir's well. He sent his ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, to fly across the worlds each day and bring him news, but he lived in fear that one day they would not return, and he would lose his capacity to think and remember. He practiced Seda, a form of magic associated with women, earning him mockery from other gods for adopting practices they considered shameful for a male deity. The gods kept their bargains when convenient and broke them when necessary. They had promised a giant payment of the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freya if he could build a wall around Asgard in a single winter, never believing he could accomplish the task. When it became clear that he would succeed with the help of his mighty stallion, the gods sent Loki in the form of a mare to seduce the stallion and delay the work. The giant failed to complete the wall in time, and Thor killed him with his hammer Mjolnir, breaking the oath the gods had made. Loki, in his mare form, gave birth to Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that became Odin's mount, a constant reminder of the deception and oath-breaking that characterized the gods' rule. These were the beings who claimed to maintain cosmic order, who demanded worship and sacrifice from mortals, who spoke of honor and glory while acting with expediency and cruelty. The contradictions were not lost on those who paid attention. The Volva who prophesied Ragnarok did not speak of it as an unjust disaster that would strike the innocent. She spoke of it as a reckoning, a moment when the consequences of countless choices and betrayals would finally come due, when the bills would be paid in blood and fire, when the order that the gods had built on foundations of deception and violence would collapse under the weight of its own corruption. The first sign that the prophecy was moving from distant threat to immediate reality came with the winters. There had always been harsh seasons in the north, times when snow piled high and the sun barely rose above the horizon, when survival required careful preparation and communal cooperation. But the Fimbulwinter was something altogether different, something that exceeded the boundaries of natural hardship and entered the realm of supernatural punishment. It was winter without end, winter without the promise of spring, winter that lasted for 3 full years with no summer to break its grip on the frozen world. The snow began to fall and did not stop. It accumulated in drifts that buried entire villages, that made travel impossible and cut communities off from one another in isolation that would prove fatal to many. The winds came from every direction, biting winds that carried ice crystals sharp enough to cut exposed skin, winds that howled like the voices of the dead crying out from Helheim. The cold was not merely the absence of warmth, it was a presence in itself, an active force that crept into homes despite the fires that families tried to maintain, that froze livestock in their shelters, that made the simple act of gathering firewood a potentially deadly endeavor. In the summers that did not come, crops failed completely. The careful stores of grain and dried meat that communities had accumulated began to run low, then ran out entirely. Hunger became the constant companion of every living thing. Animals that normally avoided human settlements grew desperate enough to attack, wolves and bears driven mad by starvation. The weak died first, the very young and the very old, those whose bodies could not sustain the constant battle against cold and hunger. But as the Fimbulwinter stretched on, even the strong began to fail. The social fabric that held communities together began to unravel under the pressure of survival. The codes that had governed behavior, the systems of honor and obligation that made civilization possible, all of these began to dissolve. Families turned against one another, fighting over dwindling supplies of food. Neighbors who had helped each other through ordinary hardships now regarded each other with suspicion and hostility. The bonds of kinship, sacred in Norse culture, began to break as brother turned against brother in competition for resources that could only sustain a fraction of those who needed them. The prophecy had spoken of this collapse with specific and terrible clarity. An axe age, a sword age when shields would be cloven and kinship would shatter. A wind age, a wolf age before the world itself would be destroyed. Men would show no mercy to one another. The old laws that prohibited the most heinous crimes, particularly kinslaying and oath-breaking, these laws would lose all force as people descended into a struggle for survival that recognized no restraint and honored no taboo. Fathers killed sons over scraps of food, brothers murdered brothers for warmer clothing or better shelter. Children abandoned elderly parents to die alone in the cold, unable or unwilling to share the meager resources that might keep them alive. The old system of reciprocal obligations, the network of debts and duties that had structured social relationships, collapsed entirely. Every person became an enemy to every other person. Trust became a luxury that no one could afford. The strong preyed upon the weak with no expectation of punishment or social consequence. This moral degradation was not separate from the physical hardship of the Fimbulwinter. The two reinforced each other in a spiral of collapse that accelerated with each passing season. As social bonds dissolved, cooperation became impossible, and the lack of cooperation made survival even more difficult. Communities that might have endured the endless winter if they had worked together instead tore themselves apart from within, ensuring that few would survive to see whatever came after. The gods in Asgard watched this dissolution with growing alarm. They could see that the Fimbulwinter was not merely an unusually harsh season, but the beginning of the sequence of events that would lead to their own destruction. Odin consulted with Mimir's severed head, preserved through magic and capable of speaking wisdom from beyond death. He sent Hugin and Munin across the worlds each day, desperate for information that might suggest a way to avert what was coming. But the ravens brought back only reports of spreading chaos, of the collapse of order in Midgard, and growing restlessness among the giants in Jotunheim. In the heavens, phenomena began to appear that filled observers with dread. The aurora borealis, normally a beautiful display of colored lights dancing across the northern sky, became more intense and took on sinister hues of blood red and sickly green. Strange lights appeared where no stars should be, moving in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. The moon grew dim, its light weakening as something began to pursue it across the sky with hunger that could not be satisfied by ordinary prey. Two wolves had been chasing the sun and moon since the beginning of time. Skoll pursued the sun, while Hati Hrodvitnison chased the moon, their eternal hunt providing the explanation for the celestial body's movements across the sky. These were no ordinary beasts. They were the offspring of a giantess who lived in a forest east of Midgard, a witch who bred monsters for purposes that even the gods did not fully understand. The wolves ran with supernatural speed and endurance, never tiring, never stopping, driven by hunger that went beyond any natural appetite. Throughout all the ages since creation, the sun and moon had stayed ahead of their pursuers, maintaining a distance that allowed them to provide light and mark the passage of days and months. But during the Fimbulwinter, as the cosmic order began to fail, the wolves began to close the gap. Skoll drew nearer to the sun, his massive jaws opening wider with each stride, his eyes fixed on the blazing orb that had always remained just out of reach. Hati closed on the moon, his breath freezing in the cold of space, his determination absolute. The people of Midgard noticed the changes first. The sun began to dim, its light weakening as Skoll came nearer. Days became shorter, not because of the season, but because the sun was being pursued more closely, forced to move faster across the sky, giving less light to the world below. The moon showed signs of being harried, moving erratically, sometimes disappearing entirely for nights at a time when Hati came particularly close to catching his prey. Then came the day when Skoll finally caught the sun. His jaws closed around it, and the world was plunged into darkness even though it was what should have been midday. The sun's light was extinguished, swallowed by the wolf who had pursued it since the dawn of time. People looked up and saw only blackness where the burning orb should have been, and in that darkness they heard the wolf's howl of triumph echoing across the sky. It was a sound that carried within it the promise of ending, the certainty that the old order was collapsing and nothing could restore what had been lost. Shortly after, Hati caught the moon as well, the silver light that had guided travellers at night and marked the passage of months disappeared into the wolf's throat. The moon's softer glow was extinguished, leaving the night sky a void of absolute darkness, broken only by the stars that still remained. But even the stars began to disappear, winking out one by one as if snuffed by invisible hands, or fleeing to some other realm where they might escape the doom that was overtaking this world. The sky itself seemed to be coming apart. The dome of heaven that had been made from Ymir's skull, decorated with sparks from Muspelheim to form the stars, this carefully constructed ceiling of the world began to show cracks and fissures. Strange lights bled through from whatever lay beyond, colors that human eyes were not meant to perceive, radiances that drove mad those who stared too long. The Bifrost bridge that connected Asgard to the other worlds began to shimmer and fade, its rainbow colors becoming unstable, flickering like a flame about to go out. In the ocean that encircled Midgard, Jormungandr stirred from his eternal sleep. The World Serpent had lain coiled around the earth for ages beyond counting, his tail in his mouth, maintaining the boundary of the known world through his very existence. But now he began to wake, disturbed by the cosmic upheaval, responding to some deep instinct that told him his time had come. His first movements sent tidal waves crashing against every shore, floods that swept away coastal settlements and drowned thousands who had survived the Fimbulwinter, only to be killed by the rising waters. The serpent's thrashing grew more violent as he continued to wake. He released his tail from his mouth, breaking the circle that had defined the limits of Midgard, opening the way for chaos to flood in from the outer void. His poison began to pour from his fangs, mixing with the ocean waters, creating a toxic fog that rolled inland and killed everything it touched. Plants withered, animals collapsed, and humans who breathed the venomous mist died choking, their lungs burned beyond any hope of healing. Jormungandr began to pull himself up onto the land, his coils crushing mountains, his weight reshaping continents. He was larger than anyone had imagined, grown to proportions that challenged comprehension during his long sleep in the depths. His head rose above the clouds, his eyes like burning suns, his jaws capable of swallowing whole armies. The ocean itself seemed to follow him as he emerged, pouring over the land in his wake, as if the waters recognized that the boundary between sea and earth no longer held any meaning. On the island of Lyngvi, in the lake called Amsvartnir, Fenrir felt Gleipnir begin to loosen. The impossible ribbon that had held him for so long was losing its power as the magic that sustained it began to fail, along with all other forms of order and constraint. The wolf had grown even larger during his captivity, fed by rage and hatred, his strength increasing with each year of imprisonment until he had become something that exceeded even the prophecies' descriptions of his terror. He pulled against his bonds with renewed fury, feeling them stretch in ways they never had before. The boulder, Gjoll, began to crack. The stone sphiti that anchored it deep in the earth started to shift. Gleipnir, made from impossible things that had held when nothing else could, began to fray. Individual threads snapped, each breaking with a sound like thunder that echoed across all the 9 worlds. Fenrir's howls grew louder, no longer muffled by the sword that had been placed in his mouth, for he had long ago broken that blade with the constant pressure of his jaws. His cries carried across the worlds, announcing to everyone who could hear that the wolf was nearly free and that his vengeance was at hand. In his cave, Loki felt his bonds beginning to weaken as well. The entrails that had been transformed into unbreakable chains started to lose their enchantment. The magic that had held them rigid for so long was dissolving as the cosmic order collapsed. He pulled at his restraints with renewed strength, ignoring the poison that still dripped on his face, ignoring the pain that had been his constant companion for ages. Sigyn still stood beside him with her bowl, still loyal after all this time, but Loki pushed her away, telling her to flee, to find safety somewhere if such a thing still existed. He wanted no witnesses to his liberation except those he intended to destroy. The dead in Helheim began to stir. Hel, the goddess who ruled that realm, felt the chains of natural law that had kept the dead separate from the living beginning to dissolve. Corpses that had lain still for centuries opened their eyes. Warriors who had died without glory, criminals who had been condemned to her cold halls, all of them began to move and walk, animated by the approaching end of all things. A ship called Naglfar, built from the untrimmed fingernails and toenails of the dead, began to creak and groan in its dock, preparing to sail, though it had no ocean to traverse except the flood that would soon cover everything. The worlds themselves began to tremble. Yggdrasil, the great ash that held everything together, shook from root to crown. Nidhogg gnawed more furiously at the roots, sensing that his work was nearly complete. The dragon and the eagle screamed at each other from their positions at the bottom and top of the tree, their ancient hatred reaching a crescendo. Ratatosk raced up and down the trunk in a frenzy, carrying insults that grew more vicious with each trip. The tree's leaves began to fall, turning brown and dead before they hit the ground, which itself was beginning to crack and split as the roots beneath lost their grip on reality. The dwarves in their underground workshops stopped their forging. The light elves in Alfheim ceased their singing. The Vanir in Vanaheim gathered in council, debating whether to honor their alliance with the Aesir or to remain neutral in the coming conflict. In every realm, beings of every kind felt the change, understood that the time of endings had arrived, and made whatever preparations seemed appropriate for the moment when everything they knew would be consumed by fire and chaos. Heimdall stood at his post on the Bifrost Bridge, as he had since the beginning of time, the watchman of the gods who never slept, who could hear grass growing on the earth and wool growing on sheep, who could see for 100 leagues in any direction, day or night. His senses were so acute that nothing could approach Asgard without his knowledge. He had been given this position because of these abilities, because the gods needed someone who could warn them of danger before it arrived at their gates. Now, as he watched the cosmic order collapse around him, he knew that the moment for which he had been stationed here had finally arrived. He held the Gjallarhorn in his hands, the great horn that had been given to him for this specific purpose. It hung from a strap around his shoulder usually, but now he lifted it to his lips, feeling its weight and significance. This was not merely a signal device, it was an instrument of fate, a tool whose sound would mark the transition from one age to another, from the time of the gods' rule to the time of their ending. Heimdall had never blown the Gjallarhorn at full strength. He had tested it only softly, careful not to create the alarm that a full blast would generate. But he had always known what its true purpose was. He looked out across the trembling worlds and saw Fenrir breaking free from his bonds on the island of Lyngvi. He saw Jormungandr rising from the ocean, poison pouring from his fangs. He saw Loki tearing himself loose from the chains that had held him in his cave of torment. He saw the ship Naglfar beginning to move, crewed by the dead from Helheim, sailing toward Asgard on waves of blood and venom. He saw fire in the south, where Surtr was beginning his march from Muspelheim, and he knew that all the prophecies were converging into this single moment. Heimdall took a deep breath, filled his lungs completely, and blew the Gjallarhorn with all the strength he possessed. The sound that emerged was like nothing that had ever been heard in the 9 worlds. It was louder than thunder, more piercing than the shriek of eagles, more resonant than the crashing of mountains into the sea. It carried across every realm simultaneously, reaching into every corner of existence, penetrating even into the land of the dead and the realm of fire. Every being that possessed ears heard it clearly, and even those without ears felt it as a vibration that passed through their very essence. The sound was a call and a warning both. It announced that the final battle was beginning, that the moment of ending had arrived, that all debts would now be paid and all fates fulfilled. For the gods in Asgard, it was a summons to gather for their last council. For the giants in Jotunheim, it was a signal to begin their march. For the dead in Helheim, it was permission to rise and walk again. For the survivors of the Fimbulwinter in Midgard, it was confirmation that their suffering had been only a prelude to something far worse. The gods heard the horn, and they came, converging on Odin's hall, from wherever they had been when the sound reached them. Thor came from the east, where he had been attempting to hold back the rising waters that Jormungandr's emergence had caused. Tyr came from his own hall, his missing hand a reminder of the betrayal that had helped bring this moment into being. Freyr arrived from Alfheim, where he had been visiting the light elves. Freyja came riding her boar Hildisvini, her face set with determination despite the fear in her eyes. Bragi and Idun came together, the god of poetry and the goddess whose apples kept the gods young. Vidar and Vali came, those silent gods who spoke seldom but would prove crucial in the battle to come. They gathered in Gladsheim, the hall where the gods held their most important councils, where the high seats stood waiting for those with the authority to occupy them. But this was not like the councils of the past, where the gods had debated and decided on matters of policy, where they had made plans and issued commands to the other realms. This council had only one purpose, to acknowledge what was happening and to prepare as best they could for the battle that could not be avoided or won. Odin sat in his high seat, Lidskjalf, from which he could see into all the worlds. He needed no reports to tell him what was occurring. He could observe it directly, watching as armies assembled and ancient enemies prepared to march. His single eye saw everything with terrible clarity. The eye he had sacrificed to Mimir's well had purchased him knowledge of this moment, but that knowledge brought no comfort and offered no escape. He saw his own death approaching in the form of a wolf whose jaws would swallow him whole. He saw the deaths of his sons, of his companions, of everything he had built and ruled for ages beyond counting. Beside his high seat stood the preserved head of Mimir, kept alive through magic, capable of speaking wisdom that exceeded anything the gods themselves could produce. Odin had consulted with this head countless times over the centuries, seeking advice on matters both trivial and crucial. Now he turned to it once more, asking questions whose answers he already knew, but needed to hear spoken aloud. Will Fenrir truly devour me? Yes, Mimir's head replied. That fate cannot be changed. Will Thor fall to the serpent's venom? Yes, even as he slays Jormungandr, the poison will take his life. Will any of us survive? Some will, Mimir answered, but not you, not Thor, not most of those gathered here. The age of your rule ends today. Odin asked whether there was any way to avoid this fate, whether some action remained that might alter the sequence of events that the Norns had woven into reality. Mimir's head spoke plainly, telling him what he had always known but refused to fully accept. The Norns did not weave fates that could be unwoven. They did not create prophecies that allowed for alternatives or exceptions. Everything that would happen in the coming battle had been decided long ago, before Odin was born, before the world was made from Ymir's corpse, perhaps even before Ginnungagap existed as the void between fire and ice. "Then we go to meet our fates with eyes open," Odin declared to the assembled gods. "We do not flee or hide or pretend that we might escape what is coming. We take the field of battle as warriors should, and we make the enemy pay dearly for their victory. We die as we have lived, with weapons in our hands and defiance in our hearts. If this is the twilight of the gods, then let it be said that we faced that twilight without flinching." The gods nodded their agreement, though some did so with more reluctance than others. They began to make their preparations, donning armor that had been forged by dwarves in the ancient days, taking up weapons that had served them in countless battles against giants and monsters. Thor lifted Mjolnir, his hammer, that had never failed to return to his hand after being thrown, that could crush mountains with a single blow. Tyr checked his sword, compensating for the missing hand that still handicapped him in combat. Freyr reached for his own sword and remembered with bitter regret that he had given it away long ago to win the hand of the giantess Gerd, leaving him with only a stag's antler to wield in the final battle. Odin walked among them, speaking words of encouragement that rang hollow even as he spoke them. He reminded them of past victories, of enemies they had overcome, of challenges they had met successfully. But everyone in the hall knew that past triumphs meant nothing now. The enemies they had defeated before were minor threats compared to what was approaching. Fenrir was not like the other monsters they had fought. Jormungandr was not merely another serpent to be slain. Surtr was not a giant who could be tricked or bargained with. These were forces of fundamental chaos, beings whose very existence was an argument against the order that the gods represented. Outside the hall, the Einherjar were assembling. These were the chosen dead, the warriors who had fallen gloriously in battle and been brought to Valhalla by the Valkyries. For ages they had feasted in Odin's hall, fighting each other during the day for sport and training, then being resurrected each evening to feast and drink mead through the night. This endless cycle of combat and celebration had been their reward for dying bravely, but it had also been a preparation. They were Odin's army for Ragnarok, the force he had been gathering since the beginning of his rule, in anticipation of this final battle. The Einherjar numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. Every warrior who had ever died with a weapon in hand, every hero who had been deemed worthy by the Valkyries, all of them were now gathering on the plains before Valhalla. They organized themselves into companies and battalions, reforming the bonds they had known in life, standing beside shield brothers and oath companions. They checked their weapons and armor, though such equipment had little meaning for the dead, and they waited for Odin to lead them to the field where they would fight their final battle. The Valkyries moved among them, those warrior women who served Odin and chose who would die in every battle fought by mortals. They wore armor that gleamed even in the darkness that had fallen over Asgard with the devouring of the sun. They rode horses that could fly through the air, that could carry the dead across the boundaries between worlds. Now they prepared to ride one last time, not to collect the fallen, but to fight alongside them. They would not choose the slain in this battle, they would join the slain themselves, adding their strength to the defense of Asgard, even though they knew that defense would fail. In the armory of Asgard, weapons that had not been used in generations were brought out and distributed. Spears forged in the First Age, swords that had tasted giant blood, axes that could split shields, and helms with equal ease. Every god who could fight would fight. Every weapon that could be wielded would be wielded. There would be no reserves held back, no force kept in safety against the possibility of future need. This was the end of future need. This was the moment when everything would be committed and everything would be lost. Frigg walked among the gods, speaking quietly with each one, offering what comfort she could, though comfort seemed impossible to find in these circumstances. She had lost Baldr to Loki's treachery, and she knew she would lose more sons before this day ended. Thor would fall to the serpent's venom. She had seen it in visions that had come to her unbidden, dreams that showed her the death of her children and the collapse of everything she had known. But she did not weep or wail. She maintained her composure, fulfilled her role as the queen of the gods, and prepared to face whatever came with the dignity that her position demanded. Odin called for Sleipnir, his 8-legged horse, the fastest steed in all the worlds. The horse had been born from Loki's shape-changed union with the giant stallion, another reminder of how the trickster's actions had woven through every aspect of the god's history. Sleipnir could ride through the air, could gallop between worlds, could carry Odin anywhere he needed to go faster than any other mount. Now the Allfather would ride him to the battlefield at Vigrid, that vast plain that had been designated in prophecy as the location where the final battle would be fought. The gods armed themselves fully, donned their helms, and prepared to march. But before they left Gladsheim, Odin spoke one final time. He reminded them that they fought not to win, for victory was impossible, but to prove that gods could face their doom without surrender. They fought to make the enemy remember this battle, to ensure that the forces of chaos would know they had been in a war, even if they emerged victorious. They fought because to do anything else would be to betray everything they had ever claimed to stand for. Courage in the face of inevitable defeat was the highest virtue the Norse people recognized, and the gods would demonstrate that virtue one final time before they passed into memory and myth. The gods roared their approval, beating weapons against shields, shouting war cries that echoed through the halls of Asgard. Then they marched out, following Odin on his 8-legged horse, with the Einherjar falling into ranks behind them. The Valkyries rode alongside on their flying horses. The whole host of Asgard moved toward Bifrost, toward the bridge that would carry them to the battlefield, though they knew the bridge would break beneath them, though they knew they marched toward their own destruction. They went anyway because that was what gods did, what heroes did, what anyone did who valued honor more than survival. On the island of Lyngvi in the lake called Amsvartnir, the final thread of Gleipnir snapped. The ribbon that had been woven from impossibilities, that had held when chains of iron had failed, that had bound the wolf for ages beyond counting, finally gave way before the force of Fenrir's rage and the dissolution of the magic that had sustained it. The wolf felt the binding release, felt the pressure that had constrained him for so long suddenly vanish, and he erupted from his prison with a howl that shook the foundations of every world. Fenrir had grown during his captivity. Rage and hatred had fed him better than any meat could have, transforming him into something that exceeded even the dire prophecies that had led to his binding in the first place. He stood taller than the tallest trees, larger than the mountains themselves. His fur was dark as the space between stars, and his eyes burned with fire that reflected not light, but the promise of destruction. When he opened his jaws, his lower jaw scraped the earth while his upper jaw reached the sky, and between those jaws was a darkness that suggested a throat leading down into an abyss from which nothing could ever return. The wolf did not pause to savor his freedom or to celebrate his escape. He remembered everything. He remembered the trust he had shown the gods when he allowed them to test their chains upon him. He remembered Tyr's hand in his mouth, the one god who had fed him, the one god who had shown him any kindness, and how that hand had been a false pledge offered in betrayal. He remembered the sword they had placed in his jaws to keep them open, the constant pain of that position, the humiliation of being displayed as a prisoner, and a warning. All of this fueled the fire that burned in his chest, directing him toward Asgard with single-minded purpose. Fenrir began to run, and his running was like the movement of avalanches and earthquakes combined. Each footfall created craters in the earth. The ground shook so violently that what remained standing after the Fimbulwinter now collapsed into rubble. Mountains crumbled as he passed them, reduced to dust by the vibrations his passage created. Rivers changed course to avoid his path, and lakes evaporated from the heat of his breath. He ran toward Asgard, toward Odin, toward the All-Father, who had ordered his binding, who would pay for that decision with his life, as the prophecy had always promised. In the ocean that encircled Midgard, Jormungandr completed his emergence from the depths. The World Serpent had released his tail from his mouth, breaking the circle that had defined the boundary of the ordered world. Now he rose higher, pulling more of his immense body up onto the land, crushing forests and cities beneath his coils. His scales were each the size of shields, harder than any metal the dwarves had ever forged. His eyes were like pools of venom, green and toxic, devoid of any emotion except the cold hunger that drove all serpents. The poison that dripped from Jormungandr's fangs had already created a toxic fog that rolled across Midgard, killing everything it touched. Now that fog grew thicker and spread faster, pushed by the wind of the serpent's breath, expanding to cover larger and larger areas, plants withered and died instantly. Animals collapsed mid-stride, their lungs burned, their blood turned to acid in their veins. Humans who had survived the Fimbulwinter, who had endured the collapse of their civilization and the devouring of the sun and moon, now died by thousands from the serpent's poison, choking and convulsing as the venom destroyed their bodies from within. Jormungandr began to move toward Asgard as well, drawn by the same inevitability that pulled Fenrir toward the realm of the gods. The serpent's path was different from the wolf's, winding and sinuous, following the contours of the landscape when it suited him and smashing through obstacles when it did not. He moved through the rising waters that his own emergence had created, swimming and crawling both, his massive body adapted to any environment. His thoughts, if they could be called thoughts, were focused on a single opponent, Thor, the thunder god, the one who had tried to catch him on a fishing line, who had battled him before in contests that had ended without clear victor. Now there would be a final meeting between serpent and god, and this time their combat would conclude with death for both. In his cave, Loki tore himself free from the chains that had bound him. The entrails of his son Nafi, transformed through magic into unbreakable iron, finally lost their enchantment as the cosmic order collapsed. The bonds fell away like dust, and Loki stood for the first time in ages, his body weakened from captivity, but his spirit burning with fury that gave him strength beyond anything physical. The serpent that had dripped venom on his face for so long struck at him one final time, but Loki caught it in his hand and crushed it, squeezing until the creature burst, and its poison ran harmlessly onto the floor of the cave. Sigyn stood nearby, still holding the bowl she had used to catch the venom all these years, her face showing the exhaustion of her long vigil. Loki looked at her, perhaps seeing her truly, for the first time since his imprisonment began. She alone had remained loyal to him when all others had abandoned him, had stood beside him through his torment, had protected him as much as she could from the poison that would have driven others mad. He told her to go, to find safety if any existed, to flee from what was coming. She refused at first, saying she would stay with him to the end, but he insisted with such vehemence that she finally agreed, disappearing into the shadows of the cave and vanishing from the tale that would unfold. Loki emerged from his cave into a world transformed by chaos. The darkness where sun and moon had been devoured pressed down like a physical weight. The fog of Jormungandr's poison drifted through the air. The trembling of Fenrir's footfalls reached even here, shaking the ground in rhythmic pulses. Loki smiled, an expression that contained no humor or joy, but only the satisfaction of seeing everything he had predicted coming to pass. The gods had thought they could maintain their order forever, had thought they could bind chaos and keep it imprisoned. Now they would learn the cost of their arrogance. Loki made his way toward the shore where the ship Naglfar waited. This vessel, built from the untrimmed fingernails and toenails of the dead, had been growing slowly over all the ages, supplied by every corpse that was not properly prepared for burial. It was enormous now, large enough to carry an army, and it was crewed by the dishonored dead from Helheim, those who had not died gloriously in battle and therefore had been denied entry to Valhalla. These dead warriors felt no loyalty to the gods who had rejected them. They would fight for anyone who offered them a chance at revenge against the divine powers that had deemed them unworthy. Hel herself, Loki's daughter, the goddess who ruled the land of the dead, stood at the helm of Naglfar. She was a figure of terrible aspect, half her body living flesh and half corpse in advanced decay. Where living skin should have been, bones showed through. Where muscles should have moved, there was only the stillness of death. But her authority was absolute in her realm, and the dead obeyed her without question. She saw her father approaching and nodded to him in acknowledgement, offering no words of greeting or sentiment. They had been separated for ages, but this was not a time for reunion or reconciliation. This was a time for war. Loki boarded Naglfar and took his place among the crew of the dead. The ship began to move, though it had no ocean to sail upon yet. It floated on the air itself, or perhaps on the floodwaters that were rising as Jormungandr's thrashing displaced entire seas and sent them pouring across the land. Naglfar sailed toward Asgard, carrying an army of the dishonored dead, captained by the goddess of death and crewed by the trickster whose malice had helped bring about this moment. It was an invasion force born from every mistake the gods had made, every betrayal they had committed, every crime they had justified in the name of maintaining order. From the south came fire that dwarfed all other fires, flames that made the burning of forests and cities seem like the guttering of candles in comparison. Surtr had begun his march from Muspelheim, and with him came the sons of Muspel, those fire giants who had existed since before creation, and who would exist after creation ended. Surtr himself was a being of such immense power that his very presence caused the ground to melt beneath his feet, turning stone to lava, transforming solid matter into burning liquid that flowed away from his path. He carried a sword that was not merely a weapon, but a manifestation of fire itself. The blade blazed with light brighter than the sun that Skoll had swallowed, heat more intense than the forges of the dwarves in their deepest workshops. Where the sword passed through the air itself ignited, creating trails of flame that lingered long after Surtr had moved on. This was the weapon that would eventually set all the worlds ablaze, that would reduce everything the gods had built to ash and cinder, that would return creation to the primal fire from which it had been momentarily separated. Surtr did not hurry. He moved with the certainty of one who knew that his victory was assured, that nothing could stop what was coming, that time itself had become irrelevant. Behind him marched the army of fire giants, each one burning with their own internal flames, each one leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. They sang as they marched, if singing was the right word for the sounds they made, wordless roars that expressed pure elemental joy at the prospect of burning away the order that the gods had imposed upon the cosmos. The giants of Jotunheim were also on the move, though they travelled separately from the forces of Muspelheim. Hrym, a giant of great power and reputation, led them from the east, sailing on a ship of his own that carried frost giants who had waited generations for this opportunity to take revenge against the gods who had killed so many of their kind. These giants remembered Ymir, their progenitor, whose murder had been the foundation upon which the gods had built their rule. They remembered every giant that Thor had killed in his endless campaigns into Jotunheim. They remembered every theft the gods had committed, every broken oath, every violation of hospitality and honor. Now they would extract payment for all of it. The forces of chaos converged on Asgard from every direction. Fenrir ran from the west, his jaws wide enough to swallow the sky. Jormungandr came from the ocean, poison pouring from his fangs, his coils crushing everything in his path. Loki sailed on Naglfar from the north, bringing the army of the dishonored dead. Surtr marched from the south with his burning sword and his host of fire giants. Hrym brought the frost giants from the east, their cold matching the fire that came from the opposite direction. All of them were drawn toward the same destination, toward the plain called Vigrid, where the final battle had been prophesied to occur. Vigrid was a vast field that stretched for 100 leagues in every direction, large enough to accommodate the armies that were gathering. It had been described in prophecy as the location of the last battle, and prophecy was now manifesting as physical reality. The ground itself seemed to prepare for what was coming, becoming harder and flatter, clearing itself of obstacles that might impede the combat. The grass died and turned to dust, leaving bare earth that would soon be soaked with the blood of gods and giants, monsters and heroes, the living and the dead, all mixed together in final conflict. The gods and their army of Einherjar were already marching toward Vigrid, having left Asgard and crossed what remained of the Bifrost Bridge. The rainbow bridge that had connected the realm of the gods to the other worlds was beginning to fail, its colors fading, its structure weakening under the weight of so many warriors crossing it. Heimdall had warned that the bridge would break, but there was no other path to take, no alternative route that would allow the gods to meet their enemies on the field of battle. They crossed in haste, trying to get their entire force across before the Bifrost gave way beneath them. The armies of chaos approached from their various directions, each force visible to the others now across the darkened landscape. Fenrir could be seen as a shape darker than the darkness, a wolf the size of mountains whose eyes burned with fire. Jormungandr was visible as a writhing mass that stretched across the horizon, his scales catching what little light remained and reflecting it in sickly green patterns. Naglfar appeared as a ship made of horror, crewed by the dead, captained by death itself. Surtr's approach was marked by the glow of flames that preceded him, turning the southern sky red and orange with the promise of burning. The frost giants came as a wave of cold that sent crystals of ice forming in the air before them. The two forces, order and chaos, divine and monstrous, moved toward collision with the inevitability of falling stones. No power in any of the 9 worlds could have stopped them now. No plea for mercy would have been heard or granted. No compromise was possible between forces so fundamentally opposed. The gods had chosen to face their doom with weapons in hand, and the forces of chaos had been waiting for this moment since the beginning of creation. On the plain of Vigrid they would meet, and the battle that followed would determine nothing except the manner of dying that each participant would experience before the end came for them all. The Bifrost Bridge had been built to last forever, constructed from materials and magic that the gods believed would endure as long as Asgard itself stood. It arched across the void between worlds, a rainbow pathway that connected the realm of the gods to the realms below, shimmering with colors that shifted and changed depending on the angle from which it was viewed. Fire burned along its length, protective flames meant to prevent frost giants from using the bridge to invade Asgard. But those flames were weakening now as all magic weakened, as all protections failed in the face of cosmic dissolution. Heimdall had led the gods and the Einherjar across the bridge, the last act of his service as watchman before he descended to meet his own fate on the battlefield. The weight of so many warriors, even warriors who were already dead and should have weighed nothing, pressed down on the structure with terrible force. The bridge groaned beneath them, its colors flickering, the magic that held it together beginning to unravel. The gods quickened their pace, urging the Einherjar to move faster, knowing that the bridge would not hold much longer. Behind them came the armies of chaos, and these forces showed no concern for the preservation of anything, including the bridge they would need to cross to reach Asgard. The frost giants, those massive beings from Jotunheim, who remembered every slight and injury the gods had ever inflicted upon their kind, thundered onto the Bifrost with such force that cracks immediately appeared in its surface. The giants were too heavy, too numerous, too filled with destructive intent for the bridge to bear. Each footfall sent tremors through the structure. Each moment brought the Bifrost closer to complete collapse. The fire that had protected the bridge from giants now worked against its integrity. The flames had kept the frost giants at bay for ages, but now those same giants pushed through the fire with determination that overcame their natural aversion to heat. They endured the burning, sacrificing the forward ranks to the flames in order to get the main body of their force across, their skin blistered and blackened. Some fell from the bridge entirely, tumbling into the void between worlds, but those who fell were replaced immediately by others who stepped over their positions without hesitation or mercy. The rainbow colors of the Bifrost began to separate, breaking apart into individual bands that no longer held together as a unified whole. Red split from orange, orange from yellow, yellow from green, each color losing its connection to the others, the spectrum dissolving into components that could not support the weight of what crossed them. The beautiful bridge that had been one of the wonders of the 9 worlds was dying, and its death throes were visible to any who looked upward from the worlds below. Then the Bifrost shattered completely. The bridge that had stood since the beginning of the gods' rule, that had carried countless warriors and messengers between Asgard and Midgard, that had been both a connection and a barrier, exploded into fragments of crystallized light that fell like stars into the void. The destruction spread from the center outward, racing faster than the giants could run, overtaking some who were still crossing, sending them tumbling into darkness. The sound of its breaking was like the cracking of ice on a frozen lake, magnified 1,000 times, a splintering that could be heard in every realm. The gods and the Einherjar had made it across before the bridge fell. The frost giants had gotten enough of their force through to form a significant army, though they had paid heavily in those who were lost to the void. But the breaking of the Bifrost meant that Asgard was now cut off from the other worlds, isolated in its high branches of Yggdrasil, with no way to reach it except by the paths the giants and monsters were already taking. The gods had crossed their last bridge. There would be no retreat from the battlefield at Vigrid, no return to their halls, no escape from what was coming. The plain of Vigrid stretched before them, vast beyond easy comprehension, a space that had been cleared by fate itself for the purpose it would now serve. The ground was hard and flat, perfect for combat, free of obstacles that might interfere with the movement of armies or the swinging of weapons. The sky above was dark with the absence of sun and moon, but a strange illumination came from other sources. Surtr's flames provided light from the south, casting everything in red and orange. The burning eyes of Fenrir glowed from the west. Strange phosphorescence rose from the waters that Jormungandr had displaced, creating a sickly green glow from the east. The gods formed their battle lines, establishing positions that had been described in prophecy and discussed in council for generations. They knew where each major combat would occur because the Volva had spoken it, and the Norns had woven it into fate. Odin would face Fenrir in one location. Thor would meet Jormungandr in another. Heimdall and Loki would find each other and engage in combat that would end both their lives. Tyr would battle Garma, the hound that guarded the entrance to Helheim. Freyr would face Surtr with only a stag's antler for a weapon, having given away his sword in exchange for marriage to a giantess he desired. The Einherjar took positions behind and among the gods, ready to engage the lesser enemies, the ordinary giants, and the dead from Naglfar, the fire giants who followed Surtr, and the various monsters that had joined the forces of chaos. These warriors had died once already and would die again here, truly, this time with no resurrection awaiting them at evening. They knew this, accepted it, and prepared to fight anyway, because that was what warriors did. Death with weapons in hand was the highest honor the Norse people recognized, and the Einherjar would demonstrate that honor one final time. The armies of chaos formed their own lines opposite the gods. Fenrir stood alone, needing no company, a force unto himself whose presence dominated the western side of the field. The wolf paced back and forth, his jaws opening and closing in anticipation, drool falling from his mouth to create new rivers on the ground below. He could see Odin across the battlefield, mounted on Sleipnir, and the wolf's hatred focused on that figure with intensity that was almost physical. Soon, very soon, those jaws would close around the Allfather, and the debt of betrayal would be paid in full. Jormungandr had pulled more of his massive body onto the land, coiling and uncoiling in preparation for combat. The serpent's scales scraped against stone with sounds like swords being sharpened. His forked tongue flickered out constantly, tasting the air, sensing the presence of Thor somewhere among the assembled gods. The serpent and the thunder god had faced each other before, in contests that had tested them both. Once Thor had tried to lift the serpent while it was disguised as a cat, failing to raise what appeared to be a harmless animal because it was actually the World Serpent in disguise. Once Thor had gone fishing for Jormungandr and nearly succeeded in pulling him from the depths before a giant cut the line in fear. Now there would be no disguises and no interruptions, only combat to the death. Loki stood with the dead from Naglfar, his presence causing unease even among those who served the forces of chaos. The trickster had been blood brother to Odin once, had lived among the gods and helped them as often as he had harmed them. But those days were long past, burned away by his imprisonment and the death of his sons, transformed into hatred that matched Fenrir's in its purity, if not in its expression. Loki's cunning would serve the cause of destruction now, his cleverness turned entirely toward the goal of bringing down everything the gods had built. Surtr towered above all others on the battlefield, visible from every part of Vigrid, his burning sword raised high so that its light illuminated the plain below. The fire giant was the physical manifestation of ending, the instrument through which creation would be returned to fire. He did not hate the gods the way Fenrir hated them, did not seek revenge the way Loki sought it. He simply was, existing as a fundamental force that would consume everything when the time came. And the time was now. The two armies stood facing each other across the expanse of Vigrid, and for a moment there was silence. No war cries were raised, no challenges were shouted. Both sides knew what was coming, knew what the prophecy had foretold, knew that courage and skill would matter less than fate in determining outcomes. But still they prepared to fight because fighting was what they did, what they were, what gave meaning to their existence in this final moment before existence itself came to an end. Odin raised his spear Gungnir, that weapon which never missed its target when thrown, which had been forged by the dwarves and given to him in the ancient days. He raised it high above his head, and the Einherjar behind him roared in response, beating weapons against shields, creating a din that echoed across the battlefield. Then Odin cast the spear over the heads of the enemy army, an act that was simultaneously a challenge, a declaration of war, and an invocation of the magic that gave him authority over battles. The spear flew in a perfect arc, sailing above the assembled forces of chaos, and where it passed, combat became inevitable. The armies surged forward to meet each other. The sound of their collision was like the grinding of continents, the crash of avalanches, the roar of waterfalls multiplied beyond comprehension. Weapons struck shields and armor with impacts that sent shockwaves through the ground. The Einherjar crashed into the army of the dead from Naglfar, and the battle was joined between those who had died gloriously and those who had died dishonorably, between those chosen by the Valkyries and those rejected by them. They fought with weapons that should have been unable to harm the already dead, but in this place, on this day, everything that should have been impossible became possible. The frost giants met the Vanir, those gods from Vanaheim who had allied themselves with the Aesir. Njord fought alongside his children, Freyr and Freya, using magic and weapons both to strike at giants who towered over them. The giants wielded clubs and axes of enormous size, weapons that could crush several warriors with a single blow. But the Vanir were quick and skilled, dodging blows that would have killed them instantly, striking at joints and weak points, using intelligence to compensate for the disparity in size and strength. The fire giants advanced like a wave of flame, setting everything they touched ablaze. The Einherjar who faced them found their weapons heating in their hands, their armor becoming furnaces that cooked them inside their own protection. Some threw down their weapons and armor to fight bare-handed rather than be burned alive, but this left them vulnerable to the giants' attacks. The smell of burning flesh began to spread across the battlefield, mixing with the other odors of combat, creating a miasma that choked those who breathed it. Heimdall sought out Loki among the chaos of battle, drawn to him by fate and by the enmity that had grown between them over the ages. The watchman of the gods and the trickster who had betrayed them moved toward each other through the press of warriors, each killing any who stood in their path, but never losing sight of their true target. They had been enemies for so long that neither could remember exactly when their antagonism had begun, but it had deepened over time until it had become something fundamental to both their identities. They met in a clearing that opened miraculously in the midst of battle, as if the other combatants instinctively moved aside to allow these two to settle their ancient dispute. Heimdall held his sword Hofud, a blade that could cut through any armor. Loki carried weapons he had taken from the dead, nothing special or legendary, just tools adequate for killing. They circled each other warily, each knowing that the other was dangerous, that this combat would end with both their deaths if the prophecy spoke truly. Loki struck first, moving with the quickness that had always been his greatest advantage. Heimdall parried and counterattacked, his superior skill with the sword evident immediately. But Loki had always fought dirty, had always used trickery and surprise rather than fair combat. He feinted high and struck low, dodged when he should have blocked, attacked from unexpected angles. The two gods wounded each other repeatedly, neither able to gain a decisive advantage, both bleeding from multiple cuts, but neither willing to yield. Tyr found himself facing Garma, the great hound that guarded the entrance to Helheim. The beast was massive, blood-stained from previous battles, his howls audible even above the general din of combat. Garma recognized Tyr immediately, recognizing perhaps the scent of a god who had bound Fenrir, who represented the order that had kept the hound chained in his role as guardian. They engaged without preliminaries, the one-handed god wielding his sword against the beast's claws and fangs, fighting with the skill born of countless battles, even as he compensated for the hand he had sacrificed to bind the wolf. Freyr confronted Surtr, that unequal battle that had been destined from the moment Freyr gave away his sword to win the giantess Gerd, the god of fertility and growth, whose power brought life to the fields and prosperity to those who honored him, now faced the fire giant, whose purpose was to burn all life away. Freyr wielded only a stag's antler, a weapon woefully inadequate for battle against a foe who carried a sword of living flame. He fought bravely nonetheless, using speed and agility to avoid Surtr's devastating strikes, landing blows of his own that might have felled a lesser opponent, but barely scratched the fire giant's burning skin. Odin rode Sleipnir toward Fenrir, with the certainty of one who knew exactly how this encounter would end. The Allfather had seen his own death in the visions granted by Mimir's well, had known for ages that the wolf would be his doom, had lived with this knowledge every day since he sacrificed his eye for wisdom. That knowledge had not made him timid or cautious. If anything, it had driven him to gather more power, more knowledge, more warriors, in the futile hope that perhaps fate could be changed or at least met with such force that the outcome might somehow be different than prophesied. The eight-legged horse carried Odin swiftly across the battlefield, leaping over fallen bodies, dodging between combatants, moving with a speed and grace that no ordinary horse could match. Odin held Gungnir, his spear that never missed its mark, and as he approached the wolf he cast it with all the strength his divine nature granted him. The spear flew true, striking Fenrir in the chest, penetrating deep into the wolf's flesh. Any other creature would have fallen dead from such a wound. Any other enemy would have been defeated by the Allfather's legendary weapon, but Fenrir was not any other creature. The spear embedded in his chest barely slowed him. He had grown too large, too powerful, too filled with rage for even Gungnir to stop him. The wolf shook himself, and the spear was dislodged, falling to the ground where it would lie forgotten while greater events transpired. Fenrir's eyes remained fixed on Odin, burning with hatred that had been accumulating since the day of his betrayal, since the moment Tyr's hand had been placed in his mouth as a false pledge of good faith. Odin drew his sword as Sleipnir brought him within striking range of the wolf. The Allfather was a formidable warrior, even without his spear, a fighter who had battled frost giants and monsters throughout the ages. He struck at Fenrir's face, aiming for the burning eyes, trying to blind the creature before those massive jaws could close on him. But the wolf was faster than something so large had any right to be. Fenrir's head moved with serpentine quickness, avoiding the sword strike, and then those jaws opened wider than they had ever opened before. The lower jaw scraped the ground of Vigrid, churning up earth and stone. The upper jaw reached toward the darkened sky, creating a cavern of fangs and darkness that seemed to lead down into an abyss beyond death itself. And then those jaws snapped shut on Odin and Sleipnir both, engulfing the Allfather and his mount in a single bite. There was no time for final words, no opportunity for heroic last stands. The prophecy was fulfilled in an instant. The chief of the gods, the ruler of Asgard, the one who had hung on Yggdrasil for wisdom and sacrificed his eye for knowledge, disappeared into the wolf's throat. Fenrir swallowed, and Odin was gone from the world. The Einherjar who witnessed this death cried out in rage and despair, but their cries did nothing to change what had happened. The Allfather had fallen exactly as the prophecy had foretold, devoured by the wolf he had tried to bind, killed by the enemy he had helped create through his own fear and treachery. The gods had lost their leader, and the battle continued without him. But Odin's son Vidar saw his father's death and was moved by grief that transcended even the deterministic fatalism of Norse culture. Vidar was one of the silent gods, a figure who spoke rarely but possessed strength second only to Thor himself. He wore a special shoe that had been crafted over ages, made from all the leather scraps that people discarded when making their own footwear. This shoe had been prepared specifically for this moment, for this purpose, though few had understood why until now. Vidar rushed toward Fenrir, while the wolf was still savoring his victory over Odin. The god moved with such speed that he reached the wolf before Fenrir could react. Vidar placed his specially crafted shoe on Fenrir's lower jaw, using the accumulated magic of all those leather scraps to hold the jaw open. Then with his bare hands he grasped the wolf's upper jaw and pulled with all his divine strength. The sound of tearing was audible across the entire battlefield. Vidar ripped Fenrir's jaws apart, tearing the wolf's mouth open so wide that the creature's skull split, avenging Odin's death by killing the monster that had devoured him. Fenrir died with a howl that shook the foundations of Yggdrasil itself, a sound of rage and pain that was also somehow a sound of satisfaction, for the wolf had accomplished what he had been bound to prevent. He had killed Odin. He had taken his revenge for the betrayal on the island of Lyngvi. That his own death followed immediately after seemed almost irrelevant. The wolf had fulfilled his purpose, had done what fate required of him, and in doing so had achieved a kind of terrible victory, even in defeat. On another part of the battlefield, Thor faced Jormungandr in combat that had been inevitable since the serpent had been cast into the ocean as an infant. The thunder god held Mjolnir, his hammer that could shatter mountains, that returned to his hand whenever he threw it. That was the symbol of his power and the instrument of his countless victories over giants. Thor had fought the World Serpent before in contests that had ended inconclusively. Now there would be a conclusion, and it would be final. Jormungandr reared up before Thor, raising his massive head high above the battlefield, poison dripping from fangs the size of spears. The serpent's eyes fixed on Thor with cold reptilian hatred, recognizing the god who had tried to catch him on a fishing line, who represented everything the serpent instinctively opposed. Jormungandr struck with the speed that made serpents deadly despite their lack of limbs, his fangs aimed at Thor's chest, intending to kill the thunder god with a single, envenomed bite. But Thor was not standing still. The god dodged to the side, and the serpent's strike missed by inches, those massive fangs slamming into the earth hard enough to create a crater. Before Jormungandr could recover, Thor swung Mjolnir with both hands, putting all his legendary strength into the blow. The hammer struck the serpent's skull with an impact that could be heard in every realm, a sound like thunder multiplied beyond any natural storm. The scales that had been harder than any metal cracked under the force of the blow. The serpent's skull shattered, fragments of bone flying in all directions. Jormungandr convulsed in his death throes, his massive body thrashing and coiling, crushing anything near him as he died. But before the serpent's life ended completely, before the light faded from those reptilian eyes, Jormungandr managed one final act. His venom, which had been dripping from his fangs throughout the battle, now poured forth in a flood. The poison sprayed across Thor in a toxic wave, soaking through the thunder god's armor, burning his skin, entering his lungs with every breath he took. Thor staggered backward, feeling the venom begin its work immediately. His divine constitution fought against it, his natural resilience struggling to reject the poison that was destroying him from within. He managed to take 9 steps away from Jormungandr's corpse, 9 steps that carried him clear of the immediate battle, and then he collapsed. The thunder god fell to his knees first, then toppled forward, Mjolnir falling from his grip for the first time since he had claimed it. Thor died there on the blood-soaked ground of Vigrid, victim of the serpent's poison, even as he had killed the serpent itself. Another prophecy fulfilled exactly as the Norns had woven it. Heimdall and Loki continued their battle, both bleeding from multiple wounds, both weakening but neither willing to yield. They had been enemies for so long that their hatred had become almost comfortable, a defining feature of their identities that made them who they were. The Watchman and the Trickster, order and chaos in personified form, circled each other amid the chaos of the larger battle, focused entirely on each other to the exclusion of everything else. Loki lunged forward, accepting a wound to his side, in order to get inside Heimdall's guard. His blade found the Watchman's throat, cutting deep, severing the arteries that carried blood to the brain. Heimdall's eyes went wide with shock, not at the wound itself, but at the realization that his death had finally arrived. He had watched the approaches to Asgard for so long, had stood guard over the gods for ages beyond counting, and now his watch was ending. But even as he fell, Heimdall's sword swept upward in a final strike, driven by reflexes that persisted even as consciousness faded. The blade caught Loki under the ribs, penetrating upward into his heart. The trickster's expression changed from triumph to surprise, then to something that might have been acceptance, or even relief. Loki had lived a complicated existence, sometimes helping the gods and sometimes working against them, never fully belonging to either order or chaos. Perhaps his death brought him a kind of peace, or perhaps it was simply another ending in a day of endings. The two gods fell together, their blood mixing on the ground. Their long enmity concluded in mutual destruction exactly as prophecy had declared. Tyr and Garma fought with a savagery that matched any other combat on the battlefield. The one-handed god wielded his sword with skill that compensated for his missing hand, striking at the monstrous hound with precise blows aimed at vital areas. Garma attacked with the mindless ferocity of a beast that knew nothing but violence, his claws tearing through armor, his fangs seeking flesh. They wounded each other repeatedly, neither gaining a decisive advantage, both knowing that this combat would end only when one or both of them was dead. Tyr's sword finally found Garma's heart, penetrating deep into the hound's chest, ending the beast's supernatural life. But even as Garma died, his jaws closed on Tyr's throat, the death reflex strong enough to tear out the god's windpipe. Tyr fell beside his enemy, blood pouring from the wound that would kill him, another god dead on the field of Ragnarok, another prophecy fulfilled in all its terrible detail. Freyr fought Surtr with courage that exceeded wisdom, knowing that his stag's antler was no match for the fire giant's burning sword, but fighting anyway because to do anything else would be to dishonor himself and his divine nature. The god of fertility dodged and weaved, trying to stay close enough to strike, but far enough to avoid Surtr's devastating attacks. He landed blows that would have killed any ordinary giant, striking at joints and eyes and any other weak point he could identify. But Surtr had no weak points. The fire giant was made of flame itself, and attacking him was like attacking a forest fire with a stick. Surtr's sword swept down in an arc that Freya could not dodge. The burning blade cut through the god's defenses, through his armor, through his flesh, splitting him nearly in half. Freya fell without a cry, his life ending instantly, his sacrifice buying nothing except the knowledge that he had faced his doom without flinching. The fire giant stood over the fallen god for a moment, looking down without expression, feeling nothing that might be called satisfaction or regret. Then Surtr moved on, seeking new enemies to burn, continuing his march toward the ultimate purpose for which he had been waiting since before creation. The deaths of these major gods rippled through the assembled armies. The Einherjar, who had followed Odin, saw their leader devoured and many lost heart, though they continued fighting because that was what warriors did. The forces of chaos grew more confident with each god that fell, sensing that victory was inevitable, that the old order was collapsing exactly as they had always believed it would. The battle became more chaotic, more desperate, more filled with acts of individual heroism and acts of random cruelty as the structure of organized combat broke down entirely. Across the field of Vigrid, lesser gods and giants continued their battles. The Vanir fought with magic and skill, but they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Einherjar sold their second deaths dearly, taking enemies with them as they fell, but they were falling in increasing numbers. The fire giants advanced like an inevitable tide, burning everything they touched, leaving only ash in their wake. The dead from Naglfar fought with the mindless ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose and nothing to gain except revenge against the gods who had rejected them. Yggdrasil itself shook with each death of a major god, the world tree trembling as if in pain or grief. The realms that hung from its branches began to destabilize, the connections between worlds growing weaker. The cosmic order that the gods had maintained through their existence was dissolving as they died, leaving nothing to hold back the chaos that had always pressed against the boundaries of creation. The Norns no longer wove at their loom beneath the tree's roots, for there were no more fates to weave when everything was ending. Surtr stood amid the carnage on the field of Vigrid, his burning sword held high, and now he fulfilled the purpose for which he had existed since before the world was made. The fire giant raised his blade toward the darkened sky and brought it down in a sweeping arc that was not aimed at any single enemy, but at reality itself. Where the sword passed, flames erupted that were unlike any fire that had burned before. These were not the familiar flames that consumed wood and warmed homes. These were flames of ending, fire that burned not just matter but the very concept of existence, reducing everything to the primal state from which creation had temporarily emerged. The flames spread from Surtr's position with impossible speed, racing across the battlefield in all directions. They consumed the living and the dead without discrimination. The Einherjar who still fought were engulfed in seconds, their forms turning to ash that scattered on winds born from the heat of burning worlds. The giants who had marched with Surtr found themselves consumed as well, for the fire giant's purpose was to burn everything, ally and enemy alike. The flames recognized no loyalty and granted no exceptions. Everything that existed would be returned to fire. The blaze reached beyond Vigrid, spreading across Midgard with the speed of thought. Forests that had stood for thousands of years were reduced to cinders in moments. Cities and villages that had been abandoned during the Fimbulwinter now burned, their empty structures collapsing into embers. The fields where crops had grown, the mountains that had stood as landmarks, the rivers that had carved their paths through stone over countless ages, all of it burned. The ocean itself seemed to catch fire, the waters boiling away to reveal the bones of ships and the ruins of civilizations that had been swallowed by the depths. The flames climbed Yggdrasil like serpents ascending a tree, wrapping around the trunk, consuming the bark, penetrating to the heartwood. The world tree had endured so much already. Nidhogg had gnawed at its roots since the beginning. The stag and deer had eaten its branches and shoots. It had trembled with each death of a major god, had suffered as the cosmic order collapsed. But it had remained standing, holding the 9 worlds in its branches, maintaining the structure of reality through sheer endurance. Now even Yggdrasil's legendary resilience could not withstand Surtr's fire. The great ash began to burn from root to crown. The flames consumed the 3 wells that nourished it. Urdabrunna, where the Norns had shaped fate, boiled away until nothing remained but a smoking crater. Mimisbrunna, where wisdom had been drawn at the price of Odin's eye, evaporated, taking with it all the knowledge it had contained. Vergelmir, that roaring spring from which rivers had flowed, dried completely, the rivers themselves turning to steam that rose into the sky and dissipated into nothing. The 9 worlds that hung from Yggdrasil's branches began to fall as the tree burned. Asgard, the realm of the gods, its golden halls and silver roofs, catching fire simultaneously, the whole realm blazing like a torch. Valhalla burned with particular intensity, all those centuries of mead and feasting providing fuel for flames that consumed the hall, where warriors had trained for a final battle they had now lost. The high seat, Hlidskjalf, from which Odin had watched the worlds, crumbled to ash. The throne room where the gods had held their councils collapsed inward, taking with it the last physical symbols of their authority. Midgard, already devastated by the Fimbulwinter and the emergence of Jormungandr, now burned completely. The few humans who had survived the earlier catastrophes died in the flames. Their suffering ended at last, but their entire civilization erased from existence. Every monument they had built, every settlement they had established, every achievement of their brief existence was reduced to nothing. The ocean that Jormungandr had encircled boiled away, revealing a seabed that immediately cracked and split under the heat, opening chasms that led down into the molten core of the world. Jotunheim burned, and with it burned the memory of the giants who had existed since before the gods. The halls where they had gathered, the mountains they had shaped into fortresses, the ancient places where Ymir's blood still stained the stone, all of it was consumed. The giants who had not marched to Ragnarok, who had remained in their realm hoping to survive what was coming, died in their homes as the flames found them. There was no escape and no shelter adequate to protect against fire that consumed reality itself. Vanaheim, home of the Vanir, burned as thoroughly as any other realm. The fields that Freyr had blessed with fertility, the harbours where Njord had calmed storms for sailors, the places where Freyr had taught cider magic, all of it disappeared into flames. Alfheim, where the light elves had dwelt in beauty and grace, was reduced to ash and ember. The elves themselves, those beings of brightness and song, were extinguished like candles in a hurricane. Their singing stopped, their light went out, and the world was poorer for their absence even as it ceased to exist. Svartalfheim, the realm of the dwarves, collapsed as the mountains that contained it melted into slag. The workshops where masterpieces had been forged, where Mjolnir and Gungnir and Gleipnir had been created, all of it was destroyed. The dwarves died in their forges, consumed by heat that exceeded anything their own fires had ever produced. Their craftsmanship, the skills that had been perfected over ages of careful work, died with them. No more would weapons be forged in the darkness beneath mountains. No more would impossible things be woven into reality through dwarven cunning. Muspelheim, already a realm of fire, seemed to grow brighter as Surtr's flames spread through it. The fire giants who had remained behind rather than marching to battle found themselves caught in conflagration that exceeded even their tolerance for heat. The realm where fire had existed since before creation now burned hotter than it ever had, as if the flames were feeding on themselves, growing stronger through their own consumption. Muspelheim did not die so much as transform into something even more primal, fire becoming the absence of fire, heat becoming the concept of heat, unmoored from physical reality. Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist, experienced a different kind of ending. The eternal cold that had defined it since the beginning met Surtr's fire, and the collision created fog of such density that visibility dropped to nothing. The ice melted catastrophically, floods of meltwater pouring out from the realm and cascading down through the branches of burning Yggdrasil. The cold and heat annihilated each other, leaving neither ice nor fire but only a void where Niflheim had been. The mists that had given the realm its name dispersed finally, revealing nothing beneath them, no substance or foundation, only emptiness. Helheim, the land of the dead, burned last of all. Hel's realm had already been emptied of most of its inhabitants when they sailed on Naglfar to fight at Ragnarok. Those who remained, the dead who were too weak or too damaged to join the battle, found no protection in their realm of death. The flames consumed them as thoroughly as they consumed the living. Hel herself, half living and half corpse, burned with her realm, her authority over death ending as death itself lost meaning in a world where nothing remained alive to die. The halls where the dishonored dead had dwelt collapsed into ruins that were themselves consumed, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. The earth itself began to sink as the flames consumed it. The ground that had been formed from Ymir's flesh, that had endured for ages beyond counting, cracked and broke apart. Massive sections of continents collapsed into the boiling seas. Mountains that had stood as landmarks since the beginning toppled like trees in a storm. The bones of the world, the underlying structure that had given it form and stability, disintegrated under the assault of Surtr's fire. The seas rose to swallow what the fire had not yet consumed. Water and flame met in clouds of steam that obscured everything, creating a fog that was simultaneously burning hot and freezing cold. The ocean that Jormungandr had encircled, released from its boundaries when the serpent died, spread across the land in waves that were themselves on fire. The water did not quench the flames. Instead, the flames set the water burning in defiance of every natural law, creating a spectacle that would have been beautiful if anyone had remained alive to witness it. The stars fell from the sky like sparks from a dying fire. Each star had been a spark from Muspelheim, placed in the dome of heaven when the gods had crafted the sky from Ymir's skull. Now they detached from their positions and tumbled downward, burning through the atmosphere, crashing into the ground or the sea. The constellations that had guided travelers and marked the seasons disappeared one by one. The darkness that had come with the devouring of the sun and moon grew deeper as the stars winked out, until the only illumination came from the flames consuming everything below. Yggdrasil's trunk cracked with a sound that echoed through all the dying worlds. The world tree, having endured everything that had been thrown at it, finally reached the limits of its endurance. The crack spread from the base of the trunk upward, climbing higher and higher, splitting the ash in half. The branches that had held the 9 worlds began to fall, tumbling downward through smoke and fire, taking with them whatever fragments of the realms still clung to them. The tree's collapse was gradual at first, almost majestic in its terrible grandeur. The uppermost branches fell first, those that had reached highest into the void above, trying to touch something beyond the created worlds. They broke away cleanly and disappeared into the smoke, never hitting anything solid, because nothing solid remained below them. The middle branches followed, the thick limbs that had borne the weight of entire realms. They fell in pieces, some burning as they fell, others breaking apart from internal stresses before they could complete their descent. The trunk itself, that massive column that had connected heaven and earth and underworld, began to topple. It fell slowly at first, so slowly that it seemed it might somehow stabilize and remain upright, but the momentum built, and the tree's fall accelerated. When the trunk finally hit the ground, what was left of the ground, the impact sent shockwaves through whatever remained of physical reality. Dust and ash rose in a cloud that darkened the sky even further. The sound was like the ending of the world, which in fact it was. And then there was nothing but fire and water and the smoke that rose from their collision. No worlds remained, no realms hung in the branches of any tree, no gods walked in golden halls. No humans tended farms or sailed seas, no giants plotted in their mountain fortresses, no dwarves forged in underground workshops, no elves sang in their bright meadows. Everything that had existed was gone, consumed by flames or drowned in floods, reduced to elements that themselves were dissolving into chaos. Surtr stood alone in the midst of desolation, his sword still burning, his purpose fulfilled. He had brought the fire that consumed creation. He had reduced the ordered world back to the primal fire from which it had been temporarily formed. The fire giant looked upon the destruction he had caused and felt nothing that might be called emotion. He was not victorious or satisfied or proud. He simply was, existing as a fundamental force in a universe that no longer contained anything except force itself, unmoored from matter or purpose or structure. The void that remained was not empty in the sense of containing nothing. It was empty in the sense that all things that had given meaning to the concept of existence were gone. There was no up or down, no light or darkness, no hot or cold. These contrasts required a framework to give them meaning, and that framework had been destroyed. What remained was something like Ginnungagap had been in the beginning, a space between things where fire and ice might eventually meet again, where creation might begin anew, but where nothing currently existed except potential waiting to be realized. The void persisted for a time that had no measure, for time itself had been a construct of the ordered world that no longer existed. There was no day or night to mark its passage, no seasons to divide it into comprehensible units, no events to give it structure or meaning. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, something began to change in the emptiness where creation had been. The waters that had risen to cover everything began to recede, withdrawing to boundaries that had not existed moments before, but now seemed natural and inevitable. And as the waters fell, land appeared beneath them. The earth that emerged was not the same earth that had sunk beneath the waves. This was a new world, green and fresh, unmarked by the scars of the old conflicts, innocent of the blood that had been spilled in Ragnarok. Grass grew on hills that had never known the tread of giants or gods. Trees rose from soil that had never been soaked with venom or burned by Surtr's flames. Rivers carved new paths through valleys that bore no memory of the rivers that had flowed before. This was a world reborn, creation beginning again from elements that had survived the ending, from potential, that had waited in the void for its moment to manifest. The sun rose in the east, though it was not the sun that Skoll had devoured. Before the old sun died, it had given birth to a daughter, and now that daughter took her mother's place in the sky. She was as bright as her mother had been, as warm and life-giving, but she was new and unburdened by the knowledge of being pursued by wolves through all the ages of the old world. She rose each morning and set each evening, marking time in the new world, giving light to what had been darkness, warmth to what had been cold. The moon appeared as well, though again it was not the moon that Hati had caught and consumed. The old moon had also produced offspring before its death, and now the new moon took up the cycle of waxing and waning that had marked the months in the world that was lost. The stars returned to the sky, new stars or perhaps the same stars reborn, arranging themselves in patterns that were similar to but not identical with the constellations that had guided travellers in the old world. The heavens were restored, and with them came the possibility of navigation, of marking seasons, of understanding the passage of time. Yggdrasil stood again at the centre of all things, though whether it was the same tree that had burned, or a new tree grown from seeds that had survived the fire, no one could say with certainty. The world tree rose strong and green, its branches reaching upward toward the heavens, its roots delving deep into wells that had been renewed. The ash was whole and healthy, unmarked by the gnawing of nidhogg or the browsing of deer. No dragon gnawed at its roots yet, though perhaps in time such threats would emerge again. For now the tree stood as it had stood in the first days of the old world, providing structure and support for reality itself. In a place called Idavol, on a plain where Asgard had once stood, the surviving gods began to gather. They came from hiding places that had protected them through the fire and flood, from refuges that fate had designated for them before the final battle began. Vidar walked from the west, his hands still stained with Fenrir's blood, having avenged his father Odin by tearing the wolf's jaws apart. Vali came from the north, another of Odin's sons who had survived where greater gods had fallen. Modi and Magni, the sons of Thor, arrived carrying their father's hammer, Mjolnir, that weapon which had survived even when its wielder had not. They stood on Idavol and looked at each other with expressions that contained grief and wonder in equal measure. They had survived Ragnarok. They had lived through the ending of everything. They alone among the Aesir remained to see the new world that had emerged from the ashes of the old. The weight of this survival pressed upon them, for they carried with them the memory of what had been lost, the knowledge of all who had fallen in the final battle. Modi lifted Mjolnir, feeling its weight, remembering watching his father wield it against Jormungandr. The hammer had been the symbol of Thor's power, the weapon that had protected Asgard from giants and monsters throughout all the ages of the old world. Now it would serve a new purpose in a new age, wielded by a new generation of gods who would have to determine what role divine beings should play in this reborn reality. The survivors walked across Idavol, searching through the grass that grew where Asgard had been. They found treasures from the old world, objects that had somehow endured the fire and flood, golden game pieces that the gods had used for entertainment in the days before Ragnarok lay scattered in the grass, untarnished and perfect. They picked up these pieces and held them, physical connections to the world they had lost, reminders of simpler times when the gods had gathered for games rather than for war councils. As they searched, they spoke among themselves about what had happened and what would come next. They remembered the fallen, reciting names and deeds, ensuring that the memory of those who had died would not be lost even though the world that had known them was gone. They spoke of Odin's wisdom and Thor's strength, of Tyr's sacrifice of his hand and Heimdall's eternal vigilance. They remembered Freyr's courage in facing Surtr with inadequate weapons, and even Loki's complicated legacy of helping and harming the gods in equal measure. Then they heard footsteps approaching, and they turned to see figures emerging from shadows that should not have existed in this bright new world. Baldr walked toward them, and beside him came Hoda, his blind brother who had thrown the mistletoe dart that killed him. The two brothers, who had been separated by death in the old world, were reunited now, reconciled in a way that would have been impossible before Ragnarok. Baldr had been held in Helheim since his murder, unable to return despite all attempts to ransom him, kept in the land of the dead by Loki's malice. But now Helheim itself had burned, its hold on the dead broken in the general dissolution, and those who had been imprisoned there were free to return. Baldr's presence transformed the gathering, the most beautiful of the old gods, the most beloved, the one whose death had been a harbinger of Ragnarok itself, now stood among the survivors in the new world. His beauty was unchanged, his wisdom intact, but he bore no bitterness about the manner of his death or his long imprisonment. He embraced Vidar and Vali, his half-brothers who had survived the final battle. He greeted Modi and Magni with warmth, remembering them as children in the old world, and seeing them now as the inheritors of their father's strength and purpose. Hoda stood quietly beside his brother, his sightless eyes turned toward the others without seeing them. The blind god who had been tricked into killing Baldr felt the weight of his unwitting crime, though he had been as much a victim of Loki's malice as Baldr himself. But Baldr showed him no resentment, held him to no account, recognized that they had both been pieces moved by fate on a board where individual will mattered less than the patterns the Norns had woven. The two brothers stood together, and in their reconciliation was a symbol of the new world's possibility for healing old wounds. The gods gathered on Idavol began to discuss what should be done in this new age. They were few in number compared to the multitude that had filled Asgard in the old world. They lacked the wisdom of Odin and Mimir, the strength of Thor, the leadership of the Allfather who had guided the Aesir through countless challenges. But they had youth and the opportunity to build something new, to avoid the mistakes that had led to Ragnarok, to create a better order than the one that had fallen. They debated whether they should rebuild Asgard in its former glory, reconstructing the golden halls and establishing themselves once again as rulers over the other realms. But some among them questioned whether such rebuilding was wise. Had not the gods' authority and their attempts to impose order through force contributed to the very catastrophes that had destroyed the old world? Had not the binding of Fenrir and the imprisonment of Loki, acts done in the name of preventing Ragnarok, actually helped bring about what they feared? Perhaps this new world required a different approach, a lighter touch, less interference from divine powers in the lives of whatever beings would inhabit the renewed earth. While the gods debated on Idavol, in another part of the new world, two humans emerged from a hiding place where they had survived the destruction of everything they had known. Their names were Lif and Lifthrasir, which meant life and the one who strives after life. They had sheltered in Hodmimir's wood during the worst of Ragnarok, protected by the trees from the fire and flood that had consumed all other humans. They had drunk the morning dew for sustenance, surviving on almost nothing while the world burned and drowned around them. Now they stepped out into sunlight in a world that was empty of other people. They were young, healthy, unburdened by the violence and despair that had characterized the end of the old age. They looked at the green earth stretching before them, the forests waiting to be explored, the fields ready to be cultivated, the rivers full of fish that had never known the taste of a hook. This world was theirs to inherit, theirs to populate, theirs to shape through their choices and the choices of the children they would bear. Lif and Lifthrasir walked hand in hand through the new world, discovering it together, naming what they found, claiming it not through conquest but through simple presence. They found fruit trees bearing unfamiliar fruits and tasted them cautiously, finding them sweet and nourishing. They discovered meadows full of plants that could be used for food or medicine or fiber. They traced the courses of rivers and found places where the land was suitable for settlement. They were alone, but they were not lonely, for they had each other, and they had the work of building a future for humanity in a world that had been cleansed of the old corruption. As they explored, they occasionally felt the presence of something watching over them, though they saw no evidence of watchers. The gods on Idavol were aware of them, these two survivors who would be the ancestors of a new human race. The divine beings debated among themselves what role they should play in the lives of Lif and Lifthrasir and their descendants. Should they reveal themselves immediately and establish relationships with humanity as the old gods had done? Should they wait and observe, offering guidance only when asked? Should they remain hidden entirely, allowing humanity to develop without divine interference? Baldr argued for a gentle approach, for allowing the new humans to find their own path without the heavy hand of divine authority directing their every step. He remembered how the gods' interference in the old world had often created as many problems as it solved, how their attempts to control fate had backfired, how their fear of prophecy had made prophecies come true. Perhaps this new world would be better if the gods served as distant guardians rather than active rulers, offering help when truly needed, but otherwise allowing events to unfold according to their own nature. Modi suggested that they should at least make their existence known, should offer Lif and Lifthrasir the benefit of the gods' knowledge and experience. Humanity in the old world had benefited from divine gifts, fire and poetry, the arts of smithing and weaving, the knowledge of agriculture and navigation. Should these new humans be denied such gifts simply because the gods were uncertain about their role? Should they be forced to rediscover everything slowly and painfully when the gods could simply teach them? The debate continued without immediate resolution, for these were questions without easy answers. But as they talked, the gods began to forge a consensus around certain principles. They would not seek to dominate or control. They would not demand worship or sacrifice as payment for their protection. They would offer guidance to those who sought it, but would not impose their will on those who preferred to make their own choices. This new world would be different from the old one, and the relationship between gods and mortals would be different as well. In the renewed halls where Asgard had been, though not in the same form or with the same grandeur, the surviving gods established themselves. They built modestly, creating homes rather than palaces, shelters rather than fortresses. They knew that this new age required humility from those who had survived Ragnarok, required them to remember what hubris and fear had cost in the old world. They would be gods still, but their divinity would be expressed through wisdom and guidance rather than through domination and control. The story of Ragnarok, as it was preserved in the Norse tradition and passed down through generations, was never merely a tale of ending. It was a meditation on the fundamental nature of existence itself, a philosophical statement about the relationship between order and chaos, creation and destruction, inevitability and free will. The Norse people who told this story and found meaning in it lived in a world where hardship was common, where winters could kill, where the social order that protected them was fragile and required constant maintenance. They understood in their bones that nothing lasted forever, that all structures eventually crumbled, that death came for everyone regardless of their power or virtue. What made Ragnarok distinctive among apocalyptic myths was not the destruction it described, but the response it demanded. The gods knew they were doomed. The prophecy had been spoken by the Völva, carved into fate by the Norns, seen by Odin in his visions from Mimir's well. There was no ambiguity about the outcome. The gods would lose, they would die. Everything they had built would be consumed by fire and drowned in floods, and yet they chose to fight anyway, not because they believed they could win, but because fighting was the only response that maintained their honor and their sense of who they were. This confrontation with inevitable doom, while refusing to surrender or despair, represented the highest ideal of Norse culture. The concept of courage in the face of certain defeat, of maintaining one's dignity and honor even when all was lost, of facing fate without flinching or begging for mercy. These were the values that defined what it meant to be worthy in the Viking Age understanding of the world. A warrior who died with weapon in hand, who went down fighting rather than submit to enemies or flee from danger, had lived well regardless of whether their cause succeeded or failed. The cyclical nature of the myth was equally important to its meaning. Ragnarok was not the end of everything in an absolute sense. It was the end of one world and the beginning of another, the conclusion of one cycle and the start of the next. The world that emerged from the floods was green and new, innocent of the corruption that had characterized the old age. Baldr returned from death to lead the surviving gods. Lif and Lifthrasir emerged to become the ancestors of a new human race. The pattern suggested that destruction and rebirth were fundamental to the structure of reality, that endings were always also beginnings, that death and renewal were two aspects of a single process. This cyclical understanding of time stood in contrast to the linear conception that would later dominate Western thought through the influence of Christianity. The Christian apocalypse led to an eternal kingdom that would last forever, a final state from which no further change was possible. But the Norse vision was of cycles within cycles, worlds born and destroyed and born again, with no ultimate endpoint but only an eternal process of transformation. Even the new world that rose after Ragnarok carried within it the seeds of its own eventual ending, just as the old world had carried the seeds of Ragnarok from the moment of its creation. The binding of Fenrir illustrated this principle with particular clarity. The gods knew the prophecy that said the wolf would devour Odin during Ragnarok. Rather than accept this fate, they attempted to prevent it by binding the wolf. But their very attempt to avoid their doom helped bring it about. By betraying Fenrir's trust and breaking their oath to him, they transformed what might have been a neutral force or even a potential ally into an implacable enemy whose hatred would drive him to fulfill the prophecy they had tried to prevent. The gods' actions created their own nemesis, demonstrating that fate operated not through external coercion, but through the internal logic of cause and effect, choice and consequence. Loki's role in the story was similarly instructive. The trickster who helped the gods as often as he harmed them, who recovered Thor's hammer and won treasures for Asgard, but also orchestrated Baldr's death and aided the forces of chaos in the final battle, represented the impossibility of maintaining pure order. Chaos and trickery were not external threats that could be eliminated through vigilance and force. They were aspects of reality itself, necessary components of a world that included change and unpredictability. By trying to imprison chaos in the form of Loki and his children, the gods only ensured that when it broke free, it would be more destructive than if they had found some way to accommodate it within their order. The deaths of individual gods during Ragnarok reflected their particular virtues and failings. Odin died seeking knowledge and power, devoured by the very threat he had tried to neutralize through imprisonment. His death suggested that wisdom alone was not sufficient, that knowing one's fate did not grant the power to change it, that the pursuit of control over destiny was itself a kind of hubris. Thor died in victory, slaying the World Serpent, but succumbing to its venom, demonstrating that even successful combat could be mutually destructive, that winning a battle might still mean losing one's life. Heimdall and Loki killed each other, the Watchman and the Trickster, order and chaos personified, ending their long enmity in mutual destruction. Their deaths suggested that neither pure order nor pure chaos could survive, that each needed the other even as they opposed each other, that the attempt to eliminate one in favor of the other would destroy both. Tyr's death at the jaws of Garma, even as he killed the beast, echoed the sacrifice of his hand to bind Fenrir, suggesting that justice sometimes required personal sacrifice, that maintaining order demanded a price that could not be avoided or transferred to others. Freya's death to Surtr's burning blade, fighting with only a stag's antler because he had given away his sword for love, represented the cost of desire and the tragedy of being unprepared for battles that could not be avoided. His death was not ignoble, for he fought with courage despite his inadequate weapon, but it was perhaps preventable, a consequence of a choice made long ago for reasons that seemed compelling at the time, but proved costly when the final reckoning came. The survival of certain gods while others fell also carried significance. Vidar and Vali, Modi and Magni, these were younger gods who had not been central to the conflicts and betrayals that led to Ragnarok. They inherited a world cleansed of the old corruption, given an opportunity to build anew without repeating the mistakes of their elders. Baldr's return from death was particularly meaningful, for he had been the most beloved of the gods, the most innocent, the one whose murder had been a signal that the old order was irredeemably broken. His presence in the new world suggested the possibility of redemption and renewal, of recovering what had been lost. The Norse people who told and retold this story were not passive recipients of a fixed myth. They shaped it through their telling, emphasized aspects that spoke to their own experiences and concerns, used it to make sense of their world and their place in it. They lived in a time and place where life was precarious, where communities depended on cooperation, but were always vulnerable to internal conflict, where the natural environment was beautiful, but could also be deadly. The Fimbulwinter that preceded Ragnarok would have been recognizable to them as an exaggerated version of the harsh winters they endured regularly, times when stored food ran low and social tensions increased. The collapse of kinship bonds that characterized the approach of Ragnarok, the brother killing brother and father turning against son, reflected the Norse people's deep understanding of how crucial social cohesion was to survival. In a harsh environment with limited resources, the breakdown of family loyalty and communal obligation was not merely unfortunate, but potentially apocalyptic. The myth suggested that social dissolution was both a sign and a cause of cosmic dissolution, that the fabric of society and the fabric of reality were woven together, that damage to one meant damage to the other. The emphasis on courage and honor in the face of inevitable doom spoke to a warrior culture that valued these qualities above almost everything else. The Norse conception of a good death, dying with weapon in hand rather than in bed from illness or old age, dying in a way that would be remembered and celebrated, dying in service to something larger than oneself, all of this was embedded in the story of Ragnarok. The gods provided a model for how to face one's fate with dignity and defiance, showing that even defeat could be glorious if met with sufficient courage. The myth also carried warnings about the dangers of certain kinds of knowledge and certain kinds of ambition. Odin's pursuit of wisdom, his willingness to sacrifice body parts and undergo torment to gain knowledge, gave him insight into what was coming, but did not grant him the power to prevent it. The story suggested that some knowledge was burdensome rather than liberating, that seeing the future clearly did not mean being able to change it, that wisdom without power to act on it might be more curse than blessing. Yet Odin sought this knowledge anyway, driven by a hunger to understand that exceeded practical considerations of benefit or harm. The role of fate in the Norse worldview, as expressed through the story of Ragnarok, was complex and somewhat paradoxical. On one hand, fate was absolute. What the Norns wove could not be unwoven. What the prophecy foretold would come to pass. The gods were bound by fate as surely as mortals were, perhaps more so because they had the knowledge to see their doom approaching but lacked the power to avoid it. On the other hand, fate operated through choices. Fenrir became the enemy who would devour Odin because the gods chose to bind him. Loki became the agent of destruction because the gods chose to imprison him. The catastrophes of Ragnarok were not arbitrary impositions from outside, but consequences that flowed naturally from actions taken freely by conscious beings making decisions. This understanding of fate allowed for moral responsibility while acknowledging limitations on free will. The gods were responsible for their choices, even though those choices led inevitably to consequences they could not control. They could not escape their fate, but they could choose how they would meet it, and in that choice lay the possibility of honor or dishonor, courage or cowardice, dignity or degradation. The emphasis was not on outcome, which was determined, but on manner, which remained subject to individual will. The legacy of Ragnarok as a myth extended far beyond the Norse culture that created it. When these stories were written down, primarily by Christian scholars in Iceland, centuries after the Viking Age ended, they were already being viewed through new cultural lenses. The monks who preserved these tales saw in them echoes of their own beliefs about apocalypse and renewal, though the Christian vision of ending and the Norse vision were fundamentally different in important ways. Yet the stories survived, transmitted across cultural boundaries, speaking to something universal, even as they remained distinctly Norse in their origins and emphasis. In later centuries, Ragnarok would be rediscovered by romantics and nationalists, artists and writers, scholars and enthusiasts, each generation finding in it something that spoke to their own concerns and circumstances. The image of gods facing inevitable doom with courage became a powerful symbol for various causes and movements, not all of them understanding or respecting the original context from which the myth emerged. Wagner's Ring Cycle transformed Norse mythology into German opera, changing emphases and meanings in the process. Modern fantasy literature drew on Ragnarok for plots and imagery, often divorcing the myth from its original cultural matrix. Yet something essential persisted through all these transformations and appropriations. The core insight that endings and beginnings were aspects of a single process, that courage in the face of doom was the highest virtue, that order and chaos were locked in eternal struggle that neither could finally win, that fate was both inescapable and somehow dependent on the choices of free beings. These ideas continued to resonate across cultures and centuries. They spoke to fundamental aspects of human experience, the knowledge of mortality, the desire for meaning in the face of inevitable death, the question of how to live well when all living eventually ends. The world that rose after Ragnarok was both a reward and a challenge for those who survived. It was green and new, free of the corruption that had characterized the old age, offering possibilities that had not existed before. But it also carried the potential for new conflicts, new betrayals, new catastrophes that might lead eventually to another Ragnarok in some distant future. The myth suggested that renewal was always possible but never permanent, that each age had to find its own way to balance order and chaos, that the work of civilization was never finished but required constant maintenance and periodic renewal through destruction and rebirth. For the Norse people who created and transmitted this myth, Ragnarok was not a story about something that would happen once at some distant point in the future. It was a lens through which they understood their own existence, a framework for making sense of loss and change, a guide for how to live with courage and honor in a world where everything eventually ended. The gods they worshipped were not distant eternal beings immune to the forces that shaped mortal life. They were subject to time and fate, vulnerable to injury and death, capable of fear and folly as well as courage and wisdom. This made them better models for human behavior than immortal gods who faced no real consequences would have been. The story ended with hope, or at least with the possibility of hope. The new world that emerged was better than the old one in important ways, cleansed of the accumulated corruption and mistakes that had led to the catastrophe. But the hope was tempered by knowledge that this new beginning carried within it the seeds of its own ending, that the cycle would continue, that future ages would face their own challenges and make their own choices that would lead to their own consequences. This was not a pessimistic vision, but a realistic one, acknowledging the mixed nature of existence, the inevitable combination of creation and destruction, order and chaos, hope and doom that characterized life in all its forms across all the ages of the world.